in the bustling market town of Ashford, where the River Len flows gently past stone bridges and timber-framed shops, a merchant named William has spent 20 years learning the weight and drape of every fabric that passes through his hands. The year is 1382, and the first Saturday of May has arrived with mild warmth and cloudless skies. Welcome to this quiet hour of the night. I am honored to share this time with you. As darkness settles around us, we will journey together to a market morning in the spring of 1382, following William through the careful rhythms of arranging his cloth before the town awakens. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort, knowing that this story asks nothing of you but to simply listen and rest. William was 43 years old, his fingers permanently sensitive to the weight of thread count, his movements measured and deliberate from decades of handling precious fabrics that could tear or soil with careless haste. He had learned his trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, and the wooden stall in Ashford's market square had belonged to their family for 3 generations. Each Saturday morning began the same way, with William rising in the darkness before dawn, dressing in his wool tunic and leather jerkin, and making his way through silent streets to the market square. The stars were still visible when he arrived, though the eastern sky had begun to pale from black to deep blue. The square lay empty and quiet, the cobblestones damp with night dew, the wooden stalls standing like patient sentinels waiting for the day to begin. William's stall occupied the same spot it always had, near the stone cross at the square's center, where morning light would fall across his wares and shoppers could examine colors without shadow. He carried the first bundle of cloth from his storehouse, feeling the familiar weight settle against his chest. The bundle contained wool, good sturdy wool dyed a deep russet brown that had come from a fuller 2 towns away. The fabric still held the faint scent of the fulling process, that clean mineral smell that spoke of careful work and proper treatment. William set the bundle on the stall's counter, a worn oak surface smooth from years of use, and began to unwrap the linen covering that protected the cloth during storage. The wool unfolded in his hands like water, heavy and substantial. He had learned long ago the exact way to drape it, how to let it cascade over the stall's display bar, so that its weight and quality became immediately apparent to anyone who passed. The fabric fell in natural folds, and William adjusted it with small movements of his fingers, smoothing a wrinkle here, straightening an edge there, until it hung precisely as it should. He returned to the storehouse for the second bundle, his footsteps soft on the cobblestones. A few birds had begun their morning songs, tentative notes that drifted through the cool air. The sky continued its slow brightening, moving from deep blue toward the pale gray that preceded sunrise. William's breath made small clouds in the morning chill, though he barely noticed. His body had grown accustomed to these early hours, to this quiet time before the market filled with voices and movement. The second bundle held linen, 3 different weights ranging from fine to coarse. The finest piece was destined for a merchant's wife who wanted new undershirts for her husband. William had shown her the fabric a week ago, and she had run it between her fingers with the careful attention of someone who understood quality. She would come today to collect it, and he wanted it displayed where she could see it immediately upon arrival. He draped the fine linen over a separate bar, positioning it so the morning light, when it came, would illuminate its pale cream color and tight weave. The medium-weight linen went beside it, and the coarse practical linen for work clothes went on the outer edge where farmers and laborers could easily examine it. Each piece required its own consideration, its own arrangement. The sky had turned from gray to pearl, and the first hints of gold touched the highest rooftops. William fetched the third bundle, this one containing his most precious goods, silk ribbons and a length of fine wool dyed with expensive madder root to achieve a rich crimson. These items he handled with extra care, unwrapping them slowly, checking for any dust or damage that might have occurred during storage. The crimson wool was beautiful in any light, but William knew it would be spectacular once the sun rose fully. The dye had taken evenly, creating a color that seemed to glow from within the fabric. He had purchased this piece from a dyer in London 3 months ago, paying more than he usually spent, trusting his judgment that someone in Ashford would want it badly enough to meet his price. So far, he had been patient, waiting for the right buyer rather than reducing his cost. He arranged the crimson wool on the central display, the place of honor where it could be seen from anywhere in the square. The silk ribbons he wound around a wooden dowel, their colors pale pink and sky blue catching what light there was. These would sell quickly once the younger women arrived. Ribbons always did well in spring, when thoughts turned to festivals and new clothes for warmer weather. Other merchants had begun arriving now, their footsteps and low voices adding gentle sounds to the morning. William knew most of them by name and had shared this square with them for years. Edmund the baker set up 2 stalls down, the scent of fresh bread beginning to drift across the cobblestones. Margaret the egg seller arranged her baskets with the same care William gave his cloth. Thomas the potter unwrapped his wares, the clay vessels clicking softly as he positioned them. No one spoke much during this early hour. They all moved through their familiar tasks with the comfortable silence of people who had worked side by side for years, who understood the importance of these quiet moments before the day's true business began. The sky continued brightening, gold spreading across the pearl gray like honey dissolving in cream. William fetched his 4th bundle, medium-weight wool in natural undyed colors, creamy white, soft gray, rich brown. These practical fabrics formed the foundation of his trade, the reliable goods that farmers' wives and craftsmen's families purchased for everyday clothing. He knew the quality of every piece, had examined each length of cloth when he purchased it, checking for flaws or weak spots that might cause problems later. The natural gray wool he positioned at eye level, where it could be easily reached and touched. Women would run their fingers along it, testing the texture, judging whether it would be too rough against skin or suitable for outer garments. William had learned to read these examinations, to know when someone was seriously considering a purchase versus merely looking. He never rushed them. Good clothes required time to appreciate, and hurrying a customer only led to regret later. His stall was taking shape now, the display bars draped with careful arrangements of color and texture. The organization followed a pattern William had refined over years. Finest goods in the center at eye level, practical goods on the sides within easy reach, specialty items like the crimson wool positioned to catch attention. It was a layout that worked, that guided customers naturally through examination and consideration toward purchase. The eastern sky had turned from gold to pale yellow, and the sun itself appeared above the roofline of the market square's eastern buildings. Light spilled across the cobblestones, warm and golden, transforming the square from a place of gray shadows into something alive with color. William's fabrics responded to the light, each one showing its true character as sunshine touched it. The crimson wool seemed to catch fire in the morning sun, its deep red glowing with an intensity that made William smile slightly. He had been right to trust his judgment on that piece. The fine linen showed its tight weave clearly now, the quality obvious to any practiced eye. Even the practical, undyed wools looked handsome in the clear morning light, their natural colors warm and honest. William stepped back from his stall, his practiced eye scanning the arrangement. Every piece hung properly, every color complemented its neighbors, every fabric was positioned for easy examination. The layout was complete, the morning's first task finished with the same care he brought to it every Saturday. His shoulders held the pleasant ache of early morning labor, the slight tiredness that came from carrying bundles and arranging heavy cloth. He allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, standing in the growing warmth of the morning sun, watching as the market square continued filling with merchants completing their own preparations. The scent of Edmund's fresh bread mixed with the earthy smell of Margaret's eggs and the clean mineral scent of Thomas's pottery. These smells, familiar and comforting, spoke of community and continuation of work done well by people who knew their crafts. The first customers would arrive soon, townspeople and farmers making their Saturday rounds, looking for what they needed or simply enjoying the social gathering that market day provided. But for now, in this gentle pause between preparation and commerce, William simply stood beside his stall, his life's work displayed before him, and felt the deep contentment that came from beginning a day properly. A sparrow landed on the edge of his stall's wooden frame, cocked its head at the fabrics, then flew away toward Edmund's bread stall. William watched it go, then turned his attention to the small wooden chest beneath his counter where he kept his measuring stick, shears, and the leather pouch that would hold the day's coins. These tools he arranged on the counter in their accustomed positions, each item placed where his hand could find it without looking when he needed it during a sale. The measuring stick was oak, worn smooth from decades of use, marked with careful notches for ells and yards. His father had made it, cutting the notches with painstaking accuracy, checking them against the standard measure kept at the guild hall. William had learned measurement from this stick, had practiced laying it along fabric until he could judge lengths within an inch by eye alone. Still, he always measured carefully when selling, never trusting his eye completely when a customer's satisfaction depended on receiving the exact amount they had paid for. The shears were heavy iron, their blades kept sharp through regular attention with a whetstone. Cutting cloth required confidence and precision. Once the shears bit through fabric, the cut could not be unmade. William had learned to cut straight and true, to follow the grain of the weave, to avoid creating ragged edges that might unravel later. These shears had served him for 15 years, and he expected they would serve him for 15 more with proper care. His leather coin pouch sat in the chest's corner, empty now but soon to be filled with the day's earnings. William lifted it out, feeling its familiar weight and texture, and set it on the counter where it would be within easy reach. The pouch had been his father's before him, the leather dark and supple with age, the drawstring still strong despite years of daily use. Market sounds have grown more distinct now. Voices called greetings across the square. Cart wheels creaked over cobblestones as farmers arrived with produce and livestock. Children's laughter rang out, bright and sudden. The quiet of early morning was giving way to the animated bustle of market day, and William felt himself settling into the familiar rhythm, his mind preparing for the conversations and transactions that would fill the hours ahead. A woman approached his stall, one of the first customers of the day. She was perhaps 30 years old, dressed in a simple wool dress and linen head covering, her hands red from work. William recognized her, though he did not know her name. She came to market most Saturdays, usually purchasing practical goods for a large household. Her gaze moved across his display, pausing on the medium-weight linen. "Good morning," William said softly, his voice carrying the pleasant neutrality of a merchant greeting a customer without pushing for immediate sale. "Good morning," she replied, her attention still on the linen. She reached out tentatively, her rough fingers brushing the fabric's surface. William waited, giving her time. He had learned long ago that silence often served better than speech when someone was making up their mind about cloth. The woman ran her hand along the linen more firmly now, testing its weight, checking its weave. She lifted a fold to examine how light passed through it, a practiced gesture that told William she understood fabric. "This is even weaving," she said, more to herself than to him. "Yes," William confirmed quietly. "It came from a weaver in Canterbury, good quality throughout." She nodded slowly, still examining the cloth. "I need 6 L's for household linens." 6 L's, William repeated, reaching for his measuring stick. He lifted the linen from its display bar and laid it carefully on the counter, smoothing it flat. The measuring stick went alongside it, and he began marking the length she needed, his movements deliberate and precise. The fabric measured exactly as he expected. Good cloth held its dimensions consistently. He reached the 6L mark and paused, looking to the woman for confirmation. She nodded, and he took up his shears, positioning them carefully at the marked point. The blades cut through cleanly, the fabric parting in a straight line that would need no further finishing. He folded the cut length neatly, creasing it along its natural folds, and presented it to the woman. She took it, examining the cut edge, checking the fold. Satisfied, she drew out her own purse and counted the appropriate coins into William's waiting palm. The transaction was complete, honest on both sides, a fair exchange that left both parties content. "My thanks," she said, tucking her purchase into the basket she carried. "Good day to you," William replied, watching as she moved on to Edmund's bread stall. The morning had truly begun now, and customers continued arriving in increasing numbers. William served them with the same careful attention he had given his first sale, measuring accurately, cutting cleanly, accepting payment graciously. Between transactions, he adjusted his display, refolding fabrics that had been examined and left somewhat disarranged, keeping his stall neat and inviting. The sun climbed higher, its warmth increasing gradually as the morning advanced. Shadows shortened across the cobblestones. The market square filled with the mingled sounds of commerce and conversation, a steady hum of human activity that rose and fell like breathing. William stood at his stall, surrounded by the work of weavers and dyers, fullers and merchants, all of them connected through the thread of trade that ran from sheep to shears to finished garment. A farmer approached, examining the practical undyed wool with an assessing eye. William waited, patient as always, while the man tested several pieces before making his choice. 3 ells of the natural gray to be made into a work tunic. William measured, cut, folded, accepted payment. The rhythm was steady and familiar, comforting in its predictability. Between customers, William allowed himself brief moments of observation, watching the market square move through its Saturday patterns. A group of children wove between stalls, their voices bright with excitement over some game that required running and dodging. Their mothers called after them occasionally, warnings to be careful, to stay where they could be seen. The children paid little attention, absorbed in their play, and the mothers returned to their marketing with the resigned acceptance of women who knew their children would survive an hour of freedom. Edmund the baker had sold through his first batch of loaves and was now displaying honey cakes, their sweet scent drifting across the square and making William's stomach remind him that he had eaten only bread and cheese before dawn. He would buy one of Edmund's cakes later, during the mid-morning lull when fewer customers needed attention. For now, he focused on the elderly woman examining his silk ribbons with careful fingers. She lifted the pale pink ribbon, holding it up to catch the light. The silk shimmered softly, its delicate color flattering in the morning sun. William knew this woman by name, Agnes, a seamstress who occasionally purchased small luxuries for her wealthier clients. She worked slowly and precisely, her aged fingers still nimble with needle and thread, despite the swollen knuckles that spoke of decades at her craft. "This pink is lovely," Agnes said, her voice quiet beneath the market's noise. "It arrived 3 weeks ago," William told her. "From a merchant who travels to the coast. The dye is steady. It will not fade quickly with washing." Agnes nodded, setting the pink ribbon down and lifting the blue. She examined it with the same care, testing the silk's weight and drape. "I have a commission," she said slowly. "A young woman is getting married in midsummer. Her mother wants blue ribbons woven through the wedding shift." "This blue would serve well," William offered. "The color is true, neither too pale nor too dark." "How much length do you have?" William had anticipated the question. He had measured the ribbon when he purchased it, knowing that customers often needed to know the total available length before committing to a project. 8 yards of the blue," he said, 9 of the pink." Agnes considered her weathered face thoughtful. "I will take 6 yards out of the blue. Can you hold the remainder? I may need more once I see how the work progresses." "I can hold it through the next market day," William agreed. "After that, if someone else needs it." "Fair enough." Agnes nodded her understanding. 6 yards of silk ribbon changed hands, measured carefully on William's stick and cut with small sharp scissors he kept specifically for delicate work. The payment was counted out in small coins, and Agnes tucked her purchase into a cloth bag she wore at her belt. The mid-morning sun had grown warm enough that William felt it on his shoulders, pleasant heat that soaked into the wool of his tunic. The market square hummed with steady activity, though the initial rush had passed. This was the time when serious buyers had made their necessary purchases and casual browsers wandered through, looking without urgency, enjoying the social atmosphere that market day provided. A young couple stopped at William's stall, their attention caught by the crimson wool. They stood close together, the young man's hand resting lightly at the small of the young woman's back. William recognized the signs, newly married or soon to be, judging by their proprietary comfort with each other, and the way they consulted in low voices about household matters. The young woman reached toward the crimson wool but hesitated, glancing at William for permission. He nodded, and she touched the fabric with tentative fingers, her eyes widening slightly at its quality. The young man leaned closer, examining the color in the bright sunlight. "This is fine work," he said to William. "What is the price?" William named his figure, watching their faces carefully. The young man's expression remained interested but cautious. The young woman's hand lingered on the fabric, her fingers stroking it gently as though memorizing its texture. "It is costly," the young man said slowly. "It is," William agreed. "The dye alone requires significant expense. Madder root in this quantity, processed to achieve such depth of color, commands a high price from the dyer. And the wool itself is the finest grade, from sheep raised specifically for textile use." The young couple exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. The young woman's hand fell away from the crimson wool reluctantly. "Perhaps another time," the young man said with obvious regret, "when we have more to set aside." William nodded, understanding completely. He felt no disappointment the crimson wool would find its buyer eventually. Good clothes could wait. "The fabric will be here," he told them. "I am in no hurry to sell it below its worth." They thanked him and moved on, the young woman glancing back once at the crimson wool with longing in her eyes. William watched them go, then turned his attention to refolding a length of linen that a previous customer had examined and left somewhat disarranged. His hands moved through the familiar motions automatically, creating neat pleats that displayed the fabric's drape while keeping it tidy. The morning continued its gentle progression. A farmer's wife purchased 4 ells of sturdy brown wool for winter cloaks that would not be needed for months yet, but that she planned ahead for, as sensible women did. A merchant servant bought fine white linen for his master's household, negotiating briefly over price before they reached an agreement both found acceptable. A craftsman examined the medium-weight fabrics, running professional fingers along edges and selvages, checking for flaws or inconsistencies before selecting 3 ells of natural gray. Between sales, William straightened his display, adjusted fabrics that had been moved during examination, and watched the market square's ongoing theater of human interaction. A dispute arose between 2 farmers over whose cart had right-of-way in the narrow passage between stalls, but it resolved quickly with some good-natured shouting and eventual laughter. A child dropped a wooden toy and burst into tears until his father retrieved it, and the world was instantly right again. A dog investigated the base of every stall systematically, hopping for fallen scraps of food. The church bell rang 10 times, marking the hour. The sound carried clearly across the market square, and several people paused briefly in their activities, some making small signs of blessing, others simply nodding the time. William felt the morning settling into its middle phase, that period when urgency had passed but the day still held hours of work ahead. He took the opportunity to step away from his stall briefly, trusting that his neighbors would keep casual watch, and walked to Edmund's bread stall. The baker looked up from wrapping a loaf for a customer, saw William, and grinned. "Finally hungry," Edmund called. "Finally have a moment," William replied. He purchased one of the honey cakes he had been smelling all morning, accepting it wrapped in a clean cloth. The cake was still slightly warm, the honey sweet and the grain nutty. He bit into it carefully, savoring the flavor, and returned to his stall while eating slowly. The honey cake satisfied his hunger and gave him a moment of simple pleasure in the midst of work. He finished it while watching the market's ongoing activity, then brushed crumbs from his tunic and returned his full attention to his business. A woman was examining his stall's contents, her gaze moving across the various fabrics with an assessing eye that suggested experience. She was perhaps 40 years old, well dressed in good wool and clean linen, her hands showing signs of prosperity rather than manual labor. William recognized the type, a merchant's or craftsman's wife, someone with both means and standards, who would know quality when she saw it and expect fair treatment in return. "Good morning," he said, his tone respectful without being obsequious. "Good morning." She continued her examination, not hurrying, taking time to look at everything before focusing on anything specific. William waited patiently, giving her space to consider. Finally, her attention settled on the fine linen he had displayed specifically for the merchant's wife who had commissioned undershirts. She touched it, testing its weight and texture. "This is the piece Martha spoke of," she said, more statement than question. William realized his mistake. This was the merchant's wife who had ordered the linen, though she looked somewhat different than he remembered. He had been expecting her later in the day, and the change in timing had caught him unprepared. He recovered quickly, hoping his momentary confusion had not been obvious. "Yes," he confirmed. "The fine linen for undershirts, 3 eels as we discussed." She nodded, still examining the fabric closely. "The quality is exactly what I hoped. My husband will be pleased." She looked up at William directly. "I will take all 6 cells you have this grade." William felt a small satisfaction at the increased sales. "I can provide 6 Ls, he confirmed, reaching for his measuring stick. He lifted the linen from its display and laid it on his counter, beginning the careful process of measuring the full length she required. The linen unfolded smoothly, its pale cream color consistent throughout its length. William measured slowly, marking each cell carefully, ensuring accuracy. The woman watched his work with attention, verifying his measurements with her own experienced eye. When he reached 6 eels, He marked the spot and looked to her for confirmation before cutting. She nodded, and he positioned his shears precisely at the mark. The blades cut through the fine linen cleanly, the fabric parting in a straight line. He folded the cut length with extra care, respecting both the fabric's quality and the customer's standards. The linen folded into a neat bundle that showed its fine weave even in its packaged form. The merchant's wife counted out the payment in silver coins, more than William usually saw in a single transaction. He accepted them gratefully, testing each coin's weight from habit, finding them all true. The woman took her purchase and thanked him before moving away through the market crowd. William placed the coins carefully in his leather pouch, feeling its increased weight with satisfaction. This had been a good morning, with several substantial sales and steady business throughout. The day was far from over. The market would continue until mid-afternoon at least. But already he felt the pleasant confirmation that his judgment in purchasing stock had been sound and his pricing fair. The sun had climbed toward its midday height, and the market square had grown considerably warmer. Some of the merchants had rigged cloth awnings over their stalls to provide shade, and customers moved more slowly in the increasing heat. William's stall faced north, which meant the sun did not strike his fabrics directly, but he felt the warmth nonetheless, a presence that made him grateful for the occasional breeze that wandered through the square. A younger merchant, Robert, who sold leather goods from the stall next to William's, called over between customers. "Busy morning for you, it seems." "Fair enough," William replied, the standard merchant's response that acknowledged success without inviting envy or ill luck. "That crimson wool catches every eye that passes," Robert observed. "Someone will claim it before summer ends." "Perhaps," William said, though privately he agreed. The crimson wool had generated significant interest, even if no one had yet met his price. Interest like that usually translates to sale eventually, when the right customer with the right means and the right need crossed paths with the fabric. An older man approached, his gait careful and his clothing marking him as prosperous but not wealthy, perhaps a successful craftsman or a minor landholder. He looked at William's display with the attention of someone who knew what he sought. His eyes settled on the medium-weight undyed wools, and he moved directly to them. "I need cloth for winter tunics," he said without preamble. 16 L's total. What is your best price for quantity?" William considered. 16 L's was a substantial purchase, likely outfitting an entire household or preparing for a season's work. The merchant tradition was to offer some reduction for large purchases, acknowledging the benefit of moving significant stock at once. He named a price per L that was slightly lower than his usual rate, watching the man's face for reaction. The older man nodded slowly, calculating total cost in his head. "Fair enough," he said after a moment. 8 L's of the gray, 8 L's of the brown." William set to work measuring and cutting, his movements efficient but not hurried. 16 L's was enough fabric to require careful handling. He laid each length out fully before cutting, ensuring that he gave accurate measure and that the fabric showed no flaws or inconsistencies. The older man watched the work with an approving eye, clearly satisfied with William's thoroughness. The cutting took time, but William did not rush. Each length was measured precisely, cut cleanly, and folded neatly before he moved to the next. When all 16 cells were prepared and stacked on his counter, he calculated the total cost and named the figure. The older man counted out the payment methodically, and William verified each coin before accepting it. "My thanks for your custom," William said as the man gathered his substantial purchase. "Good cloth, fair measure," the man replied, which was merchant speak for satisfaction. He departed, his arms full of folded wool, and William returned his attention to his stall. The substantial sale had depleted his stock of the natural-colored wool noticeably. William rearranged his display, moving remaining pieces to fill the gaps, adjusting the layout so that his stall still appeared abundant and well-stocked despite the reduction in inventory. This was part of the craft of merchanting, maintaining an appearance of plenty that encouraged customers to believe they were selecting from full stock rather than picking over remnants. The midday church bell rang, 12 strokes that marked the sun's highest point. The market's energy had shifted again, moving from the purposeful shopping of morning into a more languid afternoon phase. Some people were finishing their business and departing. Others arrived fresh, having completed morning chores at home before venturing out. Children grew tired and fractious in the heat. Merchants called to each other across the square, their voices carrying news and banter in equal measure. William felt the day's accumulation of standing beginning to settle into his legs and lower back. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, easing muscles that had held mostly still for hours. His throat was dry, and he realized he had not drunk anything since breaking his fast before dawn. He caught the eye of a young boy who wandered between stalls, one of several children who earned small coins running errands for merchants. "A cup of ale from the tavern," William said, offering the boy a half-penny, "and a penny for yourself if you're quick." The boy grinned and darted off immediately, disappearing into the market crowd with the easy speed of youth. William watched him go, then turned back to his stall as another customer approached. This was a young woman, perhaps 18 or 19, accompanied by an older woman who was likely her mother. They examined William's fabrics together, the younger woman's eyes bright with interest, the older woman's gaze more practical and assessing. William recognized the pattern: a daughter of marriageable age, a mother helping her establish a household, both of them balancing desire against means. The younger woman's attention fixed on the silk ribbons that remained after Agnes's purchase. She reached toward them with the careful reverence of someone not accustomed to handling such luxuries. The mother watched her daughter's face, her expression softening slightly at the obvious longing she saw there. "How much for a yard of the pink ribbon?" the mother asked William. He named his price, keeping his voice neutral. The mother's lips pressed together slightly, not in disapproval, but in the calculation of whether the expense could be justified. The daughter touched the pink ribbon with one gentle finger, not quite daring to lift it. "Half a yard," the mother decided, "for trim on a festival kirtle." William measured and cut the half-yard carefully, using his small, sharp scissors to ensure a clean edge on the delicate silk. The daughter watched every movement of his hands, her expression suggesting she was already imagining the ribbon sewn onto fabric, adorning a garment she would wear with pride. When William handed her the small length of pink silk, she took it as though it were something precious and fragile, which indeed it was. The mother paid, the daughter clutched her ribbon, and they moved away with matching smiles. William felt a small warmth at having provided something that brought such obvious pleasure. This was one of merchanting's satisfactions, not merely the exchange of goods for coins, but the knowledge that his wares contributed to people's lives, marked their celebrations, kept them warm and protected and occasionally beautiful. The errand boy returned with a clay cup of ale, careful not to spill despite his hurry. William thanked him, gave him his promised penny, and drank deeply. The ale was cool and slightly bitter, cutting the dust in his throat and providing welcome refreshment. He drank half the cup immediately, then set it carefully on a corner of his counter where it would not be knocked over, saving the rest for later. The afternoon stretched ahead, hours yet before the market would begin closing. William settled into the patient rhythm that characterized this time of day, serving customers when they came, tidying his stall between sales, watching the market's ongoing life unfold around him. The shadows had begun their slow journey back across the cobblestones, lengthening gradually as the sun moved past its zenith toward the western sky. A traveling peddler made his way through the market square, his pack heavy with small goods and his voice calling out wares as he walked. William watched him pass, recognizing the man from previous market days, though they had never spoken directly. The peddler's trade was different from William's. Quick small sales of needles and thread, buttons and pins, items people purchased on impulse rather than after consideration. Both trades had their place. Both served their purpose in the great web of commerce that connected town to countryside, craftsman to customer. A family approached William's stall, the father carrying a young child on his shoulders while the mother walked beside them, her hand resting on the shoulder of an older daughter. They had the look of farmers, their clothing practical and worn, their faces weathered by outdoor work. The mother's attention moved across William's display with the focused assessment of someone who knew exactly what she needed and had limited means to acquire it. She stopped before the practical undyed wools, her hand reaching out to test the brown fabric. Her fingers moved with practiced knowledge, checking the weave's tightness, the wool's weight, looking for any thin spots or irregularities that might indicate inferior quality. William waited silently, respecting her expertise. A farmer's wife knew cloth as well as any merchant. She had to, since her family's comfort through winter depended on her choices. "This brown is even throughout," she said, speaking more to herself than to William, though she glanced at him to see if he would contradict her assessment. "It is," he confirmed. "From a weaver I have used for years. She maintains consistent quality." The woman nodded, satisfied with his answer. She calculated silently, her lips moving slightly as she worked through numbers in her head. 5 ells, she said finally, "for my husband's winter cloak. His old one has worn through past mending." William measured the 5 ells carefully, knowing that this purchase likely represented a significant portion of the family's market budget. The husband watched over his wife's shoulder, the child on his shoulders leaning down to see what held everyone's attention. The older daughter stood close to her mother, observing the transaction with the attention of a girl learning how households were managed. When William cut the cloth and folded it, the mother examined his work with the same thoroughness she had given the fabric itself. She checked the cut edge, verified the fold, and only then nodded her acceptance. The coins she counted out were worn smooth, copper rather than silver, each one representing labor and careful saving. William accepted them with the same respect he would give a noble's gold, understanding the weight of what this purchase meant. "May it serve your husband well," he said as the woman took the folded cloth. "It will be well made," she replied, which was her own form of blessing, a promise that the cloth he provided would be transformed by her skilled hands into a garment worthy of his quality. The family moved away into the market crowd, and William returned the copper coins to his pouch, where they joined the morning's silver. The afternoon had settled into its warmest hour, that stretch of time when even the breeze seemed to have grown lazy and still. William finished the ale in his cup, grateful for its coolness, and set the empty vessel aside to return to the tavern later. Some of the merchants had begun eating their midday meals, bread and cheese and cold meat brought from home, and the scent of food mingled with the market's usual smells of livestock and humanity and commerce. Robert the leather merchant called over again, his mouth full of bread. "You should eat something, William. The afternoon will be long otherwise." William realized he was indeed hungry, the honey cake having been hours ago. He had more bread and cheese wrapped in cloth beneath his counter, provisions he had brought in anticipation of a long market day. He retrieved them and ate standing up, as most of the merchants did, unwilling to leave their stalls unattended even for the time it would take to sit and have a proper meal. The bread was good wheat bread from his own household, baked 2 days ago and still fresh enough. The cheese was sharp and crumbly, a local variety made by a farmer's wife who brought it to market every fortnight. William ate slowly, savoring the simple food, watching the market's afternoon patterns develop around him. A group of young men passed by, apprentices from various trades who had been given leave to attend the market. They moved with the loose-limbed energy of youth, their voices loud with laughter and banter. One of them caught sight of the crimson wool and stopped, his companions clustering around him to see what had drawn his attention. "Look at that red," one said admiringly. "Imagine a cloak of that," another added. "You would look like a prince." They laughed together at the absurdity of apprentices in princes' clothing, but the admiration in their voices was genuine. They lingered for a moment, simply looking at the crimson wool's rich color, before moving on to whatever mischief or entertainment they sought. William watched them go with a slight smile. The crimson wool served a purpose even when not purchased. It caught eyes, drew people to his stall, reminded them that beautiful things existed in the world even if not everyone could possess them. An older woman approached, moving with the careful steps of someone whose joints pained her. She examined William's remaining linens with particular attention, her weathered fingers gentle on the fabric. William recognized her after a moment, Beatrice, a widow who lived in the rooms above a cooper's shop and took in mending to support herself. "Master William," she said, her voice soft, "do you have any small remnants, pieces too short for full sale but useful for patches and mending?" William did indeed have such pieces, though he had not displayed them. He kept a separate basket beneath his counter for fabric scraps and short lengths, knowing that there were always people who needed cloth but could not afford full measures. He drew out the basket and set it on his counter where Beatrice could see its contents. Her face brightened as she sorted through the remnants, finding pieces that would serve her purposes. There was a length of linen perhaps half an ell long, several scraps of wool in various colors, a triangle of silk that had torn away from a larger piece and could not be sold as whole cloth. Beatrice selected items with the care of someone who wasted nothing, who saw possibility in every scrap. "These will do nicely," she said, gathering her chosen pieces. "What do you ask?" William named a price so low it was nearly charity, though he phrased it as fair commerce. Beatrice's dignity mattered as much as her need, and he would not insult her by offering the scraps as gifts. She paid with tiny copper coins, the smallest denominations, and tucked her purchases into the worn bag she carried. "You are kind, Master William," she said quietly. "Good cloth should not go to waste," he replied, which was true enough while also deflecting her gratitude to something less personal. She smiled at him, understanding the courtesy he offered, and moved away through the market. The basket of remnants went back beneath his counter, but William made a mental note to check it later. He tried to keep a supply of useful scraps available for people like Beatrice, who needed cloth but whose circumstances limited their means. It was good business in its own way. Such customers remembered kindness and spoke well of merchants who treated them fairly. And reputation mattered in a trade like his, where trust and reliability formed the foundation of long-term success. The afternoon continued its slow progression, the sun beginning its gradual descent toward evening though hours of daylight remained. The market's energy had shifted again, moving from the languid warmth of midday toward a renewed bustle as people completed errands they had postponed during the hottest hours. William served a steady stream of customers, none making large purchases, but the accumulation of small sales adding steadily to his coin pouch's weight. A merchant from a neighboring town stopped at William's stall, examining his goods with professional interest. William recognized the signs of someone in the same trade, assessing potential competition or perhaps looking for stock to purchase for resale in another market. They spoke briefly about sources and prices, the cautious conversation of merchants who were neither competitors nor allies, simply two people occupying adjacent spaces in the same vast network of trade. The merchant moved on without purchasing anything, and William felt neither disappointed nor relieved. Such encounters were common at the market, people gathering information, making connections, learning what was available and at what price. Not every interaction resulted in immediate sale, but all contributed to the complex web of relationships and knowledge that made commerce possible. A young mother approached with two small children clinging to her skirts. She looked harried and tired, her hair escaping from beneath her head covering, her dress bearing stains that spoke of long days managing a busy household. But her eyes showed determination as she examined William's practical fabrics, and he recognized the look of a woman who had saved carefully for something her family needed. "I need clothes for children's clothing," she said directly. "Growing boys who wear through everything, What would you recommend that will last?" William showed her the sturdy brown wool, explaining its qualities and why it would serve well for active children. She tested it thoroughly, nodding as she confirmed what he told her. They negotiated a fair price for 4 ells, enough for tunics for both boys with some left over for repairs, and William measured and cut with his usual care. As he folded her purchase, one of the children began to fuss, tired and overstimulated by the market's noise and activity. The mother soothed him absently while counting out her payment, her attention divided between commerce and childcare in the way of women with young families. William accepted her coins and wished her well, watching as she herded her children away through the crowd, the folded cloth tucked securely under one arm. The shadows had grown noticeably longer now, stretching across the cobblestones in the golden light of late afternoon. The quality of sound in the market had changed, voices carrying differently in the cooling air, the underlying buzz of activity beginning to diminish as people started thinking about returning home before darkness fell. William took stock of his remaining inventory, mentally calculating what he had sold and what remained. The day had been successful, several substantial sales, numerous smaller ones, his coin pouch pleasantly heavy with the day's earnings. The crimson wool remained, as did perhaps half his original stock of other fabrics. Some he would bring to next week's market, others he would return to storage to await a better selling opportunity. A final customer approached as the church bell rang 4 times, marking the late afternoon hour. This was a man William knew by sight and reputation, Geoffrey, a tailor who kept a shop 2 streets away and who occasionally purchased cloth from William rather than dealing directly with weavers and dyers. Geoffrey examined the remaining fabrics with an expert's eye, assessing quality and potential with the speed of long practice. "That medium linen," Geoffrey said, pointing to one of William's last unsold pieces. 3 ells if the quality holds throughout. William unfolded the linen fully so Geoffrey could examine its entire length. The tailor ran his hands along it, checking for flaws or inconsistencies, finding none. They agreed on price quickly, 2 professionals who understood each other's trade and respected each other's expertise. The transaction was completed efficiently, and Geoffrey departed with his purchase, leaving William with a significantly depleted stall. The market was beginning to close now, merchants starting to pack away their goods as the day wound toward its end. Children who had played among the stalls all day were being called home by their mothers. Farmers who had sold their produce and livestock made final purchases before beginning their journeys back to outlying villages. The square's energy was shifting one last time, moving from commerce toward conclusion. William began his own closing routine, the reverse of his morning's preparations. He gathered fabrics from their display bars, folding each piece carefully and wrapping it in protective linen before placing it in the wooden chest he used for transport. The crimson wool he handled with particular care, ensuring no dust or damage could mar its perfect surface. Each piece was accounted for, each fold checked and rechecked before being put away. Robert called over from the neighboring stall where he was packing his own goods. "Good day for you, William." "Fair enough," William replied again, the merchant's standard response that had served him well all day. "The crimson will tomorrow, perhaps," Robert said with a grin. "Perhaps," William agreed, smiling slightly at the running joke between them. The square continued emptying around them, merchants carrying away their goods, apprentices sweeping debris from in front of shops, the everyday tasks that marked market days ending. William worked steadily through his closing routine, his movements automatic from long practice, his mind already moving forward to the evening ahead and the next week's preparations. The sun had dropped low enough that it no longer reached into the square directly, though the sky remained bright with the golden light of late afternoon. Swallows darted overhead, catching insects in the cooling air, their swift flight patterns drawing invisible designs against the sky. William paused in his work to watch them briefly, appreciating their grace and speed, before returning to his task. His stall was nearly packed now, only a few items remaining to be stored away. The measuring stick went into its special case, the shears wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect their blades, the empty coin pouch tucked safely into the inner pocket of his jerkin, where its weight rested comfortably against his ribs. The day's earnings would be counted properly at home, in private, but he knew already that the market had been kind to him. The wooden chest was full, its contents secured with leather straps that William pulled tight and buckled. He would need to make 2 trips to return everything to his storehouse, but that was normal for a successful market day. Better to carry heavy loads home than to have sold nothing and carry away everything he had brought. Edmund the baker passed by, his own goods packed and his stall folded down. "Until next week, William," he called. "Until next week," William echoed, the familiar parting that marked every Saturday's ending. The square was quiet now compared to its earlier bustle, only a few merchants still finishing their closing tasks, the cobblestones littered with straw and scraps that would be swept away before darkness fell. William hoisted his chest, feeling its weight settle onto his shoulders, and began his walk back to the storehouse. The familiar streets stretched before him, the late afternoon light painting everything in warm gold, and he moved through them with the tired satisfaction of a day's work completed. The storehouse stood 2 streets from the market square, a solid stone building with a heavy oak door and small windows set high in the walls. William had rented the space for 15 years, sharing it with 2 other merchants who kept their goods in separate locked rooms. The building's thick walls kept the interior cool in summer and protected against damp in winter, making it ideal for storing cloth that could be damaged by moisture or excessive heat. William set down his chest at the storehouse door and drew out the iron key he wore on a cord around his neck. The lock turned smoothly, well maintained with regular applications of oil, and the door swung open on hinges that made only the softest creak. The interior was dim after the bright afternoon outside, and William waited a moment for his eyes to adjust before lifting his chest and carrying it inside. His storage room occupied the left rear corner of the building, a space perhaps 10 feet square with shelving built along 3 walls. The shelves held wooden chests and wrapped bundles, each one labeled with marks that told William their contents at a glance. Years of practice had taught him exactly how to organize his stock, the most frequently sold items at eye level, and within easy reach, seasonal goods higher up, specialty pieces stored with extra protection against dust and damage. He set his chest on the workbench that occupied the center of the room and began unpacking, returning each piece of cloth to its proper place. The crimson wool went onto a high shelf, wrapped in clean linen and laid flat so its weight would not stress the fabric. The remaining practical wools went into a chest designated for everyday goods. The silks and fine linens received careful placement in a smaller chest lined with additional cloth to protect their delicate surfaces. The work was methodical and peaceful, requiring attention but not intense concentration. William's hands knew these movements, had performed them hundreds of times, and he found a quiet satisfaction in the orderliness of proper storage. Each piece of cloth represented not just merchandise, but also the labor of weavers and dyers, fullers and carders, all the skilled hands that had transformed raw wool or flax into finished fabric. Treating it with care honored their work as well as his own. When the first chest was empty, William returned to the market square for his remaining goods. The square was nearly deserted now, only a handful of merchants still present, their movements slow with the tiredness that came at day's end. The cobblestones showed the marks of the day's activity, darker patches where water had been spilled, scattered straw from livestock pens, the occasional dropped item that would be claimed by whoever found it first. His stall's wooden frame still stood where it had all day, waiting to be disassembled and stored. William loaded the remaining fabrics and his tools into a second chest, then turned his attention to the stall itself. The frame came apart in sections, each piece fitting together with simple pegs that could be removed and reinserted easily. He had built this stall himself years ago, modeling it after his father's design, but making small improvements based on his own experience. The frame pieces stacked neatly, light enough that he could carry them all in one trip. William hoisted the bundle onto his shoulder and made his way back to the storehouse, his shadow stretching long before him in the late afternoon sun. The streets were quieter now, people home for their evening meals. The day's public business concluded, and private life resumed behind closed doors. At the storehouse, he packed away the stall frame in its designated corner, where it would remain until next market day. The second chest of goods he unpacked with the same care he had given the first, returning everything to its proper place, ensuring that his inventory was organized and protected. When the last item was stored and the final chest emptied, William stood in the center of his storage room and surveyed his work. The shelves were well stocked despite the day's sales, his inventory healthy and varied. He had cloth for every need and every purse, from practical everyday fabrics to specialty goods that waited for the right customer. This abundance was the result of years of careful buying, of relationships built with reliable suppliers, of judgment refined through experience about what would sell and what would languish unsold. William locked the storage room door behind him and made his way through the darkening building. The other merchants' rooms were silent. They had apparently finished their own closing tasks earlier and departed. His footsteps echoed slightly in the empty space as he walked to the main door, stepped outside, and locked it securely. The evening was settling over Ashford now, the sky deepening from gold to rose to purple in the west. Cooking fires sent trails of smoke rising from chimneys throughout the town, carrying the sense of evening meals being prepared. William's stomach reminded him that he had eaten only bread and cheese since morning, and he realized he was genuinely hungry now that the day's work was complete. His home stood 3 streets away from the storehouse, a narrow 2-story building with a shop front on the ground floor and living quarters above. His wife Margaret managed the shop during the week, selling smaller quantities of cloth to customers who could not wait for market day, and their son Thomas helped when he was not occupied with his own apprenticeship to a fuller in a neighboring town. William approached his home with the pleasant anticipation of a man who knew he would find warmth and welcome there. Light glowed in the upper windows, and he could see Margaret moving past them, her silhouette familiar and dear. He tried the shop door and found it locked. Good. Margaret had secured it properly after closing, so he went around to the side entrance that led directly to the living quarters. The door opened before he could reach for the latch, and Margaret stood there, her face showing the mild exasperation of a woman who had been watching for her husband's return and wondering what had delayed him. But her expression softened immediately when she saw him, and she stepped aside to let him enter. "Long day," she observed, more a statement than a question. "Good day," William replied, following her up the narrow stairs to their main room. The space was warm from the hearth fire, and the table was set for their evening meal. Margaret had been waiting for his return before serving, and William felt grateful for her patience. He washed his hands and face in the basin Margaret had set out, the cool water refreshing after the day's dust and heat. The soap was scented with lavender, Margaret's preference, and the familiar smell added to his sense of homecoming. He dried himself on clean linen and took his seat at the table while Margaret brought food from the hearth. The meal was simple but well prepared, pottage thick with vegetables and barley, fresh bread, cheese, and small ale. William ate with genuine appreciation, the food tasting especially good after the long day's work. Margaret sat across from him, eating her own portion while asking about the market in the indirect way of wives who wanted information but would not press for it. "The weather held fair," she said. "It did," William agreed. "Warm but not too hot, good for business. Many customers. Steady through the day. Sold the fine linen you spoke of. The merchant's wife came and bought 6 eels instead of 3. Margaret nodded with satisfaction. She had an eye for quality and had encouraged William to purchase that particular linen when he had been uncertain about the expense. Her judgment had been proven right, as it often was. They continued their meal in comfortable conversation, discussing the day's events, the customers William had served, the sales he had made. Margaret listened with the attention of someone who understood the business as well as he did, who could appreciate the significance of selling the medium-weight wool in quantity or holding firm on the crimson fabric's price. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared away, William drew out his coin pouch and spread the day's earnings on the table. He and Margaret counted together, sorting coins by type and value, calculating the total with the practiced efficiency of people who had performed this task every market day for 20 years. The sum was good, better than average, though not extraordinarily so. A solid day's work is fairly rewarded. Margaret recorded the amount in the household ledger she kept, her writing careful and clear. She had learned letters as a girl from a merchant father who believed daughters should understand accounts, and the skill had served their marriage well. William could read and write adequately, but Margaret's hand was neater and her figures more reliable. The coins went into the wooden strongbox they kept locked in their bedchamber, joining the accumulated earnings of previous weeks. Some would go to purchasing new stock, some to household expenses, some set aside for Thomas's future when his apprenticeship ended and he needed capital to establish himself in business. The cycle of earning and spending and saving that governed their lives continued its steady pattern. With the day's business concluded, William and Margaret settled into their evening routine. Margaret took up her sewing, a shirt she was making for Thomas against his return home, while William sat by the window where the last of the daylight still provided illumination. He had a piece of wool to examine, a sample a dyer had given him earlier in the week with hopes that William might purchase a larger quantity. The wool was dyed a deep blue, the color rich and even throughout. William tested it between his fingers, checking the fabric's hand, ensuring the dyeing process had not weakened the fibers. He held it up to the fatting light, looking for any variation in color that might indicate uneven dye application. The quality seemed good, consistent with what he expected from this particular dyer. He would consider purchasing some of this blue wool, he decided, though perhaps not immediately. The market for colored wools was steady but not overwhelming, and he already had adequate stock of dyed fabrics. Better to wait a few weeks, see what sold at the next several markets, and then make a decision based on actual demand rather than speculation. The evening light continued fading, the room growing dimmer despite the hearth fire's glow. Margaret rose to light a candle, placing it on the table between them so they could both benefit from its illumination. The flame steadied after its initial flicker, casting warm light across their familiar space. William found himself thinking about the day's customers, the variety of people who had stopped at his stall seeking cloth for their various needs, the merchant's wife with her household to outfit. The young couple admired the crimson wool they could not yet afford. The farmer's wife chooses carefully for her husband's winter cloak. The widow Beatrice sorting through remnants with gentle fingers. Each one represented a life, a set of circumstances, a collection of needs and desires and constraints. His trade connected him to all these lives in small ways. He provided the raw material that would be transformed into clothing, into household linens, into the fabric covering that protected and adorned and comforted. It was not heroic work, not the stuff of songs or stories, but it was honest work that served genuine needs. There was satisfaction in that, a quiet pride in doing his part in the vast network of human endeavor. Margaret hummed softly as she sewed, a melody without words that William recognized from childhood. His mother had hummed the same tune while working. The sound was soothing, mixing with the crackle of the hearth fire and the distant sounds of the town settling into night. Dogs barked occasionally. Voices called across streets. A cart rumbled past on the cobblestones below. The ordinary sounds of evening in a market town. William let his mind drift, not thinking about anything particular, simply being present in this moment of rest after labor. His body was tired in the pleasant way that came from physical work honestly performed. His stomach was comfortably full. His home was secure and warm. His wife sat across from him, her presence as familiar and essential as breathing. These simple goods seemed, in this quiet moment, to be everything necessary for contentment. The candle burned steadily, its flame unwavering in the still air of the room. William watched it for a time, observing how the wax melted and flowed down the candle's side, forming pale rivers that cooled and hardened into frozen streams. The flame consumed the wax slowly, transforming solid matter into light and warmth and the faint, sweet scent of beeswax. There was something almost meditative in watching this patient transformation. Margaret finished the seam she was working on and held up the shirt to examine her progress. She nodded slightly, satisfied with her work, and folded the garment carefully before setting it aside. Her sewing basket went onto the shelf where she kept it, and she returned to sit at the table, her hands folded in her lap, her expression peaceful in the candlelight. "Thomas will be home in 3 weeks," she said softly. "Will he?" William had lost track of the time since their son's last visit. His master sent word. The fuller's wife is expecting a child, and Thomas asks for leave to visit before the baby arrives, and his master's household becomes too busy. William nodded, pleased at the prospect of seeing their son. Thomas was 18 now, in the final year of his apprenticeship, nearly a man, though William still sometimes saw the boy he had been. The fuller's trade was good work, steady and necessary, and Thomas had shown aptitude for it. In another year, he would complete his training and need to decide whether to stay in his master's town or return to Ashford to establish his own business. "We should have the house ready for him," Margaret continued. "Perhaps a special meal." "Whatever you think best," William replied, knowing that Margaret would arrange everything properly regardless of his input. She managed the household with the same skill and attention he brought to his trade, and he trusted her judgment completely. The evening deepened into full night, and the sounds from the street below gradually diminished as people retired to their beds. The candle had burned down perhaps a third of its length, and William realized he was growing genuinely tired now that he had stopped moving. The day had been long, beginning in darkness before dawn and ending now in darkness after sunset. Margaret rose and began the routine of preparing the house for night, banking the fire so it would last until morning, checking that doors were secured, setting out what would be needed for breaking their fast. William helped with the familiar tasks, moving through them with the automatic ease of long practice. When everything was prepared, they climbed the stairs to their bedchamber, where the bed waited with clean linens and wool blankets. William removed his outer clothing and lay down with a sigh of relief, his tired body grateful for the bed's support. Margaret settled beside him, and they lay quietly for a moment, not speaking, simply sharing the peace of day's end. Through the small window, William could see a slice of night sky where stars had begun appearing, tiny points of light against the vast darkness. His mind drifted back over the day one final time. The early morning arrangement of his stall, the steady flow of customers, the transactions completed fairly on both sides, the satisfaction of work done well. Tomorrow was Sunday, a day of rest when the market square would stand empty and the town would gather for worship. He would attend service with Margaret, spend a quiet day at home, and begin preparing mentally for the following week's business. but those concerns belonged to tomorrow. For now, in this moment, there was only the comfort of his bed, the warmth of his home, the peaceful darkness settling over Ashford like a blessing. William's breathing slowed and deepened, his body relaxing into rest, and the day's memories faded gently into the approaching realm of sleep. The morning of the Lord's Day arrived with the church bells ringing across Ashford, their clear tones calling the faithful to worship. William woke to the familiar sound, his body still heavy with the previous day's labor, but his mind clearing quickly as consciousness returned. Beside him, Margaret stirred and sat up, reaching for the simple linen shift she wore over her night clothes when moving about the house in the early morning. The bedchamber was cool, the night's chill having crept through the small window despite the shutters. William dressed in his better tunic, the one Margaret had woven from fine wool 2 years ago, and dyed a sober dark blue appropriate for church attendance. The fabric had worn well, maintaining its color and showing only the slightest signs of use at the cuffs and hem. He fastened his belt and drew on a wool hose, his movements slow with the stiffness that always came the morning after market day. Margaret dressed with equal care, choosing a kirtle of good brown wool and a linen headcloth that she arranged with practiced fingers. She moved about the bedchamber, gathering the items they would need. A small prayer book her father had given her at her marriage, a pouch containing a few coins for the church's collection, and a clean handkerchief. Her movements were quiet and efficient, the routine of Sunday morning as familiar as breathing after 20 years of marriage. Downstairs, Margaret prepared a simple breaking of fast, bread left from the previous night's supper, a bit of cheese, and a small ale. They ate standing at the table, not bothering to sit since they would need to leave for church soon. The meal was brief and satisfying, enough to sustain them through the morning service, but not so much as to make them sleepy during the priest's sermon. The streets were filled with people when William and Margaret stepped outside, all of Ashford flowing toward the church like water finding its natural course. Families walked together, children scrubbed clean and dressed in their best clothing, their usual boisterousness subdued by parental warnings to behave properly. Merchants and craftsmen nodded greetings to each other, their weekday competitions set aside for this day of rest and worship. The church stood at the town's highest point, its stone tower visible from anywhere in Ashford. The building was perhaps 200 years old, its walls thick and solid, its narrow windows letting in limited light that made the interior feel cave-like and mysterious. William had known this church his entire life, had been baptized here as an infant, confirmed here as a boy, and married Margaret here in a ceremony witnessed by both their families. They entered through the main door, dipping their fingers in the holy water font and making the sign of the cross as generations had done before them. The interior was cool and dim after the morning brightness, the air heavy with the scent of incense and old stone. Candles burned on the altar, their flames steady in the still air, illuminating the painted figures of saints on the wall behind. William and Margaret took their usual places in the nave, standing among the other merchants and their families. The church had no benches. People stood for services, though the elderly and infirm were permitted to sit on small stools brought from home. The stone floor was cold beneath William's feet even through his leather shoes, but he barely noticed, his attention drawn forward to where the priest was preparing for Mass. Father Benedict was an elderly man, perhaps 60 years old, his thin hair white and his body bent from decades of bowing in prayer. He had served this church for 30 years, baptizing children who were now bringing their own children for baptism, burying grandparents and parents, and occasionally heartbreaking small ones who had not survived their first years. His voice, when he began the Latin prayers, was surprisingly strong despite his aged appearance, carrying clearly through the church's stone spaces. The Mass proceeded through its familiar patterns, prayers and responses, scripture readings, the elevation of the consecrated host. William followed along with the automatic participation of someone who had attended countless services, his lips forming the responses without conscious thought, his body knowing when to bow and when to make the sign of the cross. The ritual was comforting in its unchanging nature, a connection to something larger and more enduring than individual lives. Margaret prayed with her eyes closed, her lips moving silently through prayers William could not hear. Her hands were folded before her, and her face held the peaceful expression she always wore during worship. He felt a surge of affection for her, this woman who had shared his life for so long, who stood beside him in church as she stood beside him in all things. The sermon, when it came, was mercifully brief. Father Benedict spoke about the parable of the talents, encouraging his flock to use wisely the gifts God had given them, to work diligently in their various callings, to remember that all work honestly done was service to the divine. It was practical theology suited to a congregation of craftsmen and merchants, farmers and laborers, people whose days were filled with tangible tasks and visible results. William listened with half his attention, his mind drifting occasionally to thoughts of the coming week's business, then returning guiltily to the present moment. He tried to focus on Father Benedict's words, to find in them some wisdom or guidance, but his tired mind wandered despite his best intentions. Margaret, he noticed, listened with complete attention, her face turned toward the priest, absorbing every word. The Mass concluded with final prayers and blessings, and the congregation began filing slowly out of the church into the bright morning sunshine. People clustered in small groups outside, exchanging greetings and news, the social aspect of Sunday worship as important in its way as the spiritual one. William found himself drawn into conversation with several other merchants, discussing the previous day's market, comparing sales, sharing information about suppliers and prices. Edmund the baker was there, still dusted with flour despite his Sunday clothing. Robert the leather merchant stood nearby, his wife beside him holding their youngest child. Thomas the potter nodded to William from across the churchyard, his hands stained with clay that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. These were William's people, his community, bound together by shared trade and shared place. Margaret had moved away to speak with a cluster of women, their heads closed together as they exchanged whatever news and concerns occupied women's conversations. William could see her listening intently to something Agnes the seamstress was saying, her expression sympathetic. The women's network of information and support paralleled the men's, serving different purposes but equally important to the community's functioning. The sun had climbed higher while they were in church, and the day was warming pleasantly. The sky held only a few small clouds, white and harmless, drifting lazily across the blue expanse. A perfect day for rest, William thought, for the quiet restoration that Sunday was meant to provide after 6 days of labor. Eventually, the crowd began dispersing, people making their way home for their midday meals, and William and Margaret walked back through Ashford streets together. The town had an empty quality on Sunday mornings, most shops closed and most people at home, a peaceful pause in the usual bustle of commerce and activity. At home, Margaret prepared their Sunday dinner, the main meal of the week when she cooked more elaborately than on working days. Today she had a roasted chicken, precious and expensive, saved for this special meal. The bird had been turning slowly over the fire while they were at church, and its savory smell filled their home. She added vegetables, turnips and onions and carrots and fresh bread, and they sat down to eat at their leisure, no work pressing them to hurry. The chicken was tender and flavorful, the vegetables soft and sweet from slow cooking. William ate slowly, savoring each bite, the richness of the meal a weekly reminder that their labors provided well for their needs. Margaret served him the choicest portions, keeping the lesser bits for herself in the way of wives who put their husbands first, though William always tried to ensure she ate adequately as well. After dinner, with the dishes cleared and put away, they settled into the quiet leisure that characterized Sunday afternoons. Margaret returned to her sewing, though today she worked on something decorative rather than practical, embroidering small flowers onto a linen cloth that would serve as a table covering for special occasions. Her needle moved in and out of the fabric with practiced rhythm, creating patterns of color and texture that transformed plain cloth into something beautiful. William sat in his chair by the window, a position that had become his customary resting place. He had brought up from the shop a bolt of wool he had been considering, wanting to examine it more carefully in good light, and with time to really assess its qualities. The fabric was a natural cream color, undyed, the wool's own tone showing through. He unrolled a length of it across his lap, his fingers moving over its surface, reading the weave like others might read written words. The wool was good quality, he confirmed, the fibers long and strong, the weave tight without being stiff. It would wear well and take dye evenly if a customer wanted it colored. The price the supplier had quoted was fair, not a bargain but not excessive either. He would purchase a quantity of it, he decided, perhaps 20 ells, enough to have adequate stock without tying up too much capital in a single item. Having made this decision, William set the wool aside and allowed himself to simply rest. The room was warm from the hearth fire, comfortable without being stifling. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. Margaret's needle made soft sounds as it passed through fabric, a gentle, rhythmic whisper. William's eyes grew heavy, and he did not fight the drowsiness that crept over him. Sunday afternoon naps were customary, a restoration of energy after the week's labors. He settled deeper into his chair, his breathing slowing, and let sleep take him into its gentle embrace. He woke perhaps an hour later. The sun's angle shifted, but the day was still bright. Margaret had set aside her embroidery and was reading from her prayer book, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the familiar Latin phrases. She glanced up when William stirred, smiled at him briefly, then returned to her reading. William stretched carefully, working out the stiffness that came from sleeping in a chair. His body felt more rested now, the deep tiredness from market day finally beginning to ease. He rose and moved to the window, looking out over Ashford's rooftops toward the countryside beyond the town's edges. The fields surrounding Ashford were green with growing crops, the spring planting now well established and thriving. He could see tiny figures moving in distant fields, farmers who worked every day regardless of the church's command to rest, driven by the necessities of agriculture and the knowledge that crops waited for no man's convenience. William felt a moment of sympathy for them, his own Sunday rest suddenly seeming a luxury. The afternoon continued its peaceful progression. Margaret prepared a light supper of bread and cheese and cold chicken left from their dinner. They ate as the sun began its descent toward evening, the quality of light shifting from bright afternoon to the softer glow of approaching dusk. After supper, they sat together at the table, Margaret with her embroidery once more, William simply present and quiet, content to do nothing more demanding than exist in this moment. The church bells rang for vespers, calling those who wished to attend evening prayers. William and Margaret exchanged glances. Neither felt moved to return to church. Having fulfilled their Sunday obligation with morning mass, they remained at home as darkness gathered outside, the day drawing toward its close with the same gentle inevitability that marked all natural cycles. Margaret lit a candle as the room grew dim, the flame pushing back the shadows and creating a circle of warm light around their table. She continued her embroidery for a short while longer, working to complete a particular flower before the light failed completely. William watched her hands move, admiring the skill that guided her needle so precisely, creating beauty from simple thread and fabric. When Margaret finally set aside her work for the night, they prepared the house for sleep as they had the evening before. The fire was banked, doors checked, everything put in order for the new day that would begin in just a few hours. They climbed to their bedchamber, where William removed his better tunic and hung it carefully for next Sunday's wearing. Lying in bed, William reflected on the day's pattern, worship and rest, meals and conversation, small tasks and long stretches of simple peace. It was not exciting, this Sunday rhythm, but it was restorative. His body had needed this day of reduced activity. His mind had needed the break from commercial calculations and customer interactions. Tomorrow he will return to work refreshed, ready to begin preparing for next week's market. Margaret settled beside him, and they lay quietly in the darkness, not quite ready for sleep but moving toward it gradually. Through the window, stars were visible, the same stars that had watched over countless Sunday evenings, countless cycles of work and rest. "A good day," Margaret said softly. "A good day," William agreed. His breathing deepened and slowed, his body relaxing completely into the bed's support, and the week's labors and the day's rest blended together into a sense of wholeness, of life lived in balance between effort and ease, work and worship, action and stillness. The new week began on Monday morning with pale sunlight filtering through the bedchamber window and the sounds of Ashford awakening, cart wheels on cobblestones, a rooster's distant crowing, the murmur of voices from the street below. William rose with the familiar heaviness of a man whose body had grown accustomed to rest and must now return to labor. But the feeling was not unpleasant, merely the natural resistance that came with any transition. He dressed in his everyday tunic, the wool worn soft from years of use, comfortable against his skin. This was his working clothing, practical and sturdy, showing the small stains and repairs that marked garments subjected to daily wear. Margaret was already up, he realized, hearing her movements from the room below where she would be rekindling the fire and preparing their morning meal. Downstairs, the main room was warming gradually as the fire caught and grew. Margaret had set out bread and cheese, and she poured ale into wooden cups as William took his place at the table. They ate without hurrying, the morning stretching before them with tasks to accomplish but no urgent deadlines pressing. "I thought about opening the shop today," Margaret said between bites of bread. "There are several women who mentioned needing cloth this week, and they may come by rather than waiting for Saturday's market." William nodded. The shop they maintained on the ground floor of their home served precisely this purpose, providing cloth to customers who needed smaller quantities or who could not attend market day. Margaret managed it skillfully, knowing the stock as well as William did, able to judge quality and quote fair prices. The income from shop sales supplemented their market earnings and kept them connected to their neighborhood customers throughout the week. "I will be at the storehouse most of the day," William said, "taking inventory, checking what needs replenishing before the next market, perhaps visiting the fuller about that blue wool he showed me." They finished their meal and went about their separate tasks, the division of labor that allowed their household to function smoothly. Margaret descended to open the shop, unlocking the heavy door and swinging the shutters wide to let in light and signal that business was welcome. William gathered what he needed for his day's work: a wax tablet for making notes, his keys, a leather satchel for carrying samples. The walk to the storehouse took him through Ashford's morning streets, now fully awake and busy with the week's commerce. Shops were opening, craftsmen beginning their work, apprentices running errands. William exchanged greetings with several people he knew, brief acknowledgments that maintained the social connections essential to a merchant's success. At the storehouse, he unlocked his room and stood for a moment in the doorway, surveying his inventory with a merchant's assessing eye. The shelves were reasonably well stocked, but he could see gaps where Saturday's sales had depleted certain items. The practical brown wool was running low. He had sold more than expected and would need to replenish that soon. The medium-weight linens also needed attention. The crimson wool remained patient and beautiful, waiting for its eventual buyer. William pulled out his wax tablet and began a systematic inventory, moving along each shelf and recording what he had and what quantities remained. This was tedious work but necessary, the foundation of good business management. He could not purchase wisely without knowing precisely what he had in stock, could not set prices accurately without understanding his inventory's value. The morning passed slowly in this careful accounting. William worked methodically, checking each bundle and chest, comparing actual stock against his mental records of what should be present. Occasionally, he found small discrepancies, a piece of cloth he had forgotten about, or a bundle that contained slightly less than he remembered. These he noted carefully, adjusting his records to reflect reality rather than assumption. By mid-morning, his inventory was complete, and William sat on his workbench studying the wax tablet's surface, where his stylus had scratched notes and figures. He needed perhaps 30 ells of practical wool in various colors, 20 ells of medium linen, and some additional silk ribbons if he could find them at reasonable prices. The heavier winter fabrics could wait. It was only late spring, and customers would not begin thinking seriously about winter clothing for several months yet. He considered his various suppliers, mentally reviewing who had what goods and at what prices. The weaver in the next village produced excellent practical wool at fair cost. The fuller 2 towns away could provide the blue wool he had been considering, and William could examine his other stock as well. The linen merchant who traveled through Ashford monthly was due to arrive within the week, and William could purchase from him when he came. These decisions made, William locked the storehouse and set out to visit the fuller, whose workshop lay perhaps an hour's walk from Ashford along a road that wound through fields and small woods. The day had warmed pleasantly, and William found the walk enjoyable, a change from standing at his market stall or sitting in his storehouse. The road was well traveled and safe, used regularly by merchants and farmers moving goods between towns. The countryside was beautiful in late spring, the fields bright with growing crops, hedgerows thick with leaves, wildflowers dotting the grassy verges. William walked steadily, his merchant's mind calculating and planning even as his senses absorbed the peaceful rural surroundings. A lark sang somewhere overhead, its song tumbling down from heights William could not see. Sheep grazed in a distant pasture, their forms white against green grass. The fuller's workshop stood just outside the next village, positioned near a stream whose water was essential for the fulling process. William could hear the steady thump of the fulling mill as he approached, a rhythmic pounding that had probably been continuous for hours. The fuller, whose name was John, emerged from the workshop as William drew near, his clothing damp and his hands showing the stains of his trade. "Master William," John called in greeting, "have you come about that blue wool?" "Among other things," William replied. "I would see what else you have that might interest me." John led him into the workshop, a large stone building filled with vats and drying racks, the air heavy with the smell of wet wool and the soap used in fulling. Several pieces of cloth hung on racks, and John showed them to William with the pride of a craftsman displaying his work. The blue wool William had seen a sample of was there, along with several other colors, a deep green, a rusty red, a golden yellow. William examined each piece carefully, testing the fabric's weight and texture, checking the evenness of the dye, looking for any flaws that might affect value. The quality was consistently good. John was a skilled fuller, his work reliable. They discussed prices, negotiating with the comfortable directness of men who had done business together for years and understood each other's positions. Eventually, they reached agreement on quantities and cost. William would take 20 eels of the blue wool, 10 ells of the green, and 5 ells of the red. The yellow he passed on. He had adequate stock of warm-colored fabrics already. John would prepare the cloth for transport and have it delivered to William's storehouse by week's end. Payment would be half now, half on delivery, the standard arrangement between established trading partners. With business concluded, John offered ale and bread, and they sat in the workshop's yard sharing a simple meal while talking of general matters, weather and crops, mutual acquaintances, the state of trade. This social aspect of commerce was as important as the transactions themselves, maintaining relationships that made business possible. The walk back to Ashford took William through the warmest part of the afternoon, the sun high and strong, the road dusty beneath his feet. He moved without hurry, content to let the journey take whatever time it required. His mind drifted pleasantly, not focused on anything particular, simply present in the moment of walking through familiar countryside on a fair spring day. By the time he reached home, the afternoon was well advanced. The shop door stood open, and William could hear Margaret's voice inside speaking with a customer. He climbed the stairs to their living quarters, not wanting to interrupt her business, and found the main room warm and quiet. He poured himself ale from the jug on the table and sat by the window, grateful for rest after the day's walking. Margaret's voice continued below, rising and falling in the rhythms of commerce, discussing, explaining, agreeing. William smiled slightly, hearing in her tone the same patient courtesy he brought to his own customer interactions. They were well matched in this as in so many things, both understanding that successful trade required not just good products but good relationships, not just fair prices but fair treatment. The customer eventually departed, and Margaret climbed the stairs, her face showing the mild fatigue that came from standing and talking through much of the day. She settled into her chair with a small sigh of relief, slipping off her shoes and flexing her feet. "Busy day?" William asked. "Steady," she replied. "3 sales, nothing large, but all good custom. Agnes came by for a thread. The baker's wife needed linen for household repairs, and a farmer's daughter bought wool for a new kirtle." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people whose lives had become so intertwined that words were often unnecessary. The afternoon light slanted through the window, painting everything in warm gold, and the sounds of Ashford streets drifted up to them. Children playing, dogs barking, the distant ring of a smith's hammer on anvil. Margaret rose after a while to begin preparing their evening meal, and William remained at the window, watching the day move toward dusk. The sky was beginning to show the first hints of color, pale pink touching the clouds along the western horizon. Swallows darted past, catching insects in the cooling air, their flight swift and sure. The evening meal was simple, pottage and bread, the everyday food that sustained working people. They ate at their table as darkness gathered outside, the single candle Margaret had lit creating a circle of light that held back the shadows. The meal satisfied William's hunger, and he felt the deep tiredness that came from a full day's useful work beginning to settle into his bones. After supper, they prepared the house for night with their usual routine, and William found himself grateful for the comfortable predictability of these patterns. There was peace in knowing what each day would bring, in the steady rhythm of work and rest, commerce and home, the endless cycle that gave structure and meaning to life. In their bedchamber, William removed his boots and outer clothing, his body grateful for the bed's waiting comfort. Margaret settled beside him, and they lay quietly, not quite ready for sleep but moving toward it gradually. Through the window, the first stars had appeared, tiny points of light emerging from the darkening sky. William's mind drifted back over the day, the morning's inventory, the walk to the fuller's workshop, the successful negotiations, the return home to Margaret's presence. Small things, ordinary things, the substance of a merchant's life. Yet in their accumulation, they created something larger, a livelihood, a household, a place in the community, a sense of purpose and contribution. His breathing deepened and slowed, his thoughts growing less distinct, and the day's activities faded gently into the approaching realm of sleep, leaving only a quiet contentment, a sense of days well spent in honest labor, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same, an endless, gentle repetition that was not monotony, but rather the comforting rhythm of a life well lived. Tuesday morning arrived with light rain pattering against the window shutters, a soft, persistent sound that had begun sometime in the night and showed no signs of ending. William woke to the gray dimness of a cloudy day, the room cooler than usual, the air carrying the fresh mineral scent of rain on stone. He dressed more warmly than he had the previous day, adding an extra layer beneath his tunic against the damp chill. Margaret was already downstairs, and William found her standing near the hearth where the fire burned more vigorously than usual, its warmth welcome on this wet morning. She had prepared porridge for their breakfast, hot and thick with honey stirred through it, the kind of substantial meal that fortified against cold weather. They ate standing near the fire, grateful for its heat, watching through the window as rain continued falling steadily on Ashford streets. "A poor day for the shop," Margaret observed. "People will stay home in weather like this." William nodded agreement. Rain kept customers away unless their needs were urgent, and few cloth purchases qualified as urgent. Still, Margaret would open the shop as usual, maintaining regular hours regardless of whether anyone came. Reliability mattered in trade. Customers needed to know when they could find you available. "I will work in the storehouse," William said, organizing what came back from the market, preparing displays for next Saturday. They finished their meal and went about their separate tasks. Margaret descended to the shop despite the rain's discouragement, while William gathered his cloak and prepared to venture out. The rain was steady but not heavy, the kind that soaked slowly rather than drenching immediately. He pulled his hood up and stepped into the wet morning. The streets were nearly empty, most people sensibly staying indoors when work did not demand otherwise. The few figures William passed moved quickly, heads down, intent on reaching their destinations. Water ran in small streams along the gutters, carrying away debris and making the cobblestones slick. William walked carefully, placing his feet with attention to avoid slipping. At the storehouse, he shook water from his cloak before entering, not wanting to bring excessive dampness inside where it might affect his fabrics. The building's interior was cool but dry, the thick stone walls keeping out the weather's moisture. In his storage room, William lit a candle to supplement the gray light coming through the high windows and surveyed the work ahead of him. The fabrics that had returned from Saturday's market needed proper storage now that he had completed his inventory. Some required refolding to eliminate creases from transport and display. Others needed inspection for any damage or soiling that might have occurred during the market's bustle. All needed to be returned to their designated places in his organized system. William began with the crimson wool, unrolling it completely on his workbench to examine its full length. The fabric remained perfect, no marks or damage, its deep red color unchanged. He refolded it carefully, creating pleats that would not stress the fabric, and wrapped it in clean linen before returning it to its high shelf. Such valuable goods deserved extra care. Next came the practical wools, the everyday fabrics that formed the foundation of his trade. These he inspected more quickly, his experienced hands finding any flaws or problems automatically. Most were fine, showing only the minor wrinkles that came from folding and transport. One piece had acquired a small smudge along one edge. He made a note to clean it before the next market, knowing that even minor imperfections could affect a customer's willingness to purchase. The work was methodical and somewhat tedious, but William found a quiet satisfaction in it nonetheless. This attention to detail, this careful maintenance of inventory, was part of what made him successful. Customers trusted him because his goods were always properly stored and presented, because he knew every piece in his stock and could speak honestly about its qualities. Outside, the rain continued its steady drumming, creating a cocoon of sound around the storehouse. William worked on, the candles flamed steady in the still air, his hands moving through familiar tasks. He refolded linens, inspected silks, reorganized shelves to make room for the new stock that would arrive from the fuller by week's end. By mid-morning, his storage room was immaculate, every piece in its proper place, every shelf organized logically. William stepped back and surveyed his work with satisfaction. This order, this careful arrangement, allowed him to work efficiently at market, to find what customers wanted quickly, to present his goods in the best possible manner. He extinguished the candle and locked the storehouse, venturing back into the rainy streets. The rain had lessened somewhat, becoming a light drizzle rather than steady precipitation, though the sky remained gray and low. William made his way through puddles and running water, his cloak and hood keeping him mostly dry. At home, he found Margaret in the shop, sitting on a stool with embroidery in her lap, working by the light from the open door. No customers had come, as she had predicted, and she had filled the quiet hours with her needlework. She looked up as William entered, shaking rain from his cloak. "Finished at the storehouse?" she asked. "Everything is in order," he confirmed. "Ready for the fuller's delivery and for the next market." They climbed the stairs together, leaving the shop open but unattended. Anyone who entered would hear them above and could call out if they needed service. In the main room, Margaret added wood to the fire, building up its warmth against the day's persistent dampness. William hung his wet cloak near the hearth to dry, feeling the chill begin to leave his bones as heat soaked into him. Margaret prepared a midday meal of bread and cheese and cold meat, simple fare that required no elaborate cooking. They ate at the table, the rain sound a constant background, the fire's crackle and pop counterpointing it. The gray light from outside made the room feel enclosed and intimate, a small warm space carved out of the larger wet world. After eating, William found himself at loose ends, his planned tasks complete and the weather discouraging any outdoor work. He settled into his chair with a piece of mending he had been postponing, a tear in his everyday tunic that needed stitching before it worsened. His needlework was adequate but uninspired, functional rather than beautiful, yet he had learned the basic skills necessary to maintain his own clothing. Margaret returned to her embroidery, and they sat together in companionable silence, both occupied with needlework, the rain continuing outside. There was something peacefully domestic about the scene, William thought. Husband and wife working side by side on quiet tasks, the day's commerce suspended by weather, time moving slowly through the gray afternoon. The hours passed in this gentle fashion, marked only by the need to add wood to the fire occasionally and the gradual dimming of already dim light as afternoon moved toward evening. No customers disturbed the shop's quiet. No errands called them out into the rain. They simply sat and worked and existed together in the peaceful tedium of a rainy day. Eventually, Margaret rose to prepare their evening meal, and William set aside his mending, the tear now adequately repaired if not beautifully finished. The rain had finally stopped, he noticed, though the sky remained overcast and threatening. Water dripped from eaves and shutters, the aftermath of the day's steady precipitation. They ate their supper as daylight faded completely into night, and William felt the peculiar tiredness that came from a day of reduced activity. His body had not worked hard, yet somehow the grayness and dampness had drained energy nonetheless. When they finally retired to their bedchamber, he was genuinely ready for sleep despite the day's relative idleness. Lying in bed, listening to water still dripping outside, William reflected on how different this day had been from Monday's sunshine and purposeful activity. Yet both days were necessary, he supposed, the active and the quiet, the productive and the restorative. Even merchants needed occasional pauses, times when weather or circumstance imposed rest. His eyes grew heavy and he let them close, his breathing deepening into the rhythms of approaching sleep. Tomorrow would likely be clearer, he thought drowsily, the rain having passed through, leaving freshness in its wake. There would be work to do, preparations to continue for next market day, the steady progression toward Saturday's commerce. But those concerns belonged to tomorrow. For now, there was only this moment of rest, the soft darkness of the bedchamber, Margaret's quiet breathing beside him, and the gentle descent into sleep that gathered him in like a familiar embrace, carrying him away from the day's damp grayness into the peaceful realm where weather and work, commerce and care, all faded into the simple, undifferentiated darkness of deep rest. Wednesday morning brought the promised clearing, the sky washed clean by Tuesday's rain and now showing pale blue between dissipating clouds. William woke to sunlight streaming through the window, bright and almost startling after the previous day's grayness. The air smelled fresh, scrubbed of dust, and carried a coolness that spoke of the night's chill still lingering. He dressed and descended to find Margaret already preparing their morning meal. The bread she set out was fresh, purchased from Edmund the baker's shop the previous evening, and its yeasty scent filled their rooms. They ate standing as had become their habit on weekday mornings, neither wanting to waste time sitting when the day's work awaited. "The linen merchant should arrive today or tomorrow," Margaret said between bites. "I heard from Agnes yesterday that he was seen 2 towns over making his rounds." William nodded, pleased at this news. The linen merchant, whose name was Peter, traveled a circuit through the surrounding region, bringing goods from weavers who lived too far away to attend local markets directly. William had been waiting for his arrival, needing to replenish the medium-weight linens that had sold well at the last market. "If he comes today, send word to the storehouse," William said. "I want to see his stock before others have picked through it." Margaret agreed, and they finished their meal. William gathered what he needed for the day: his keys, his coin pouch with silver for purchases, a mental list of what he sought. The streets were busier than they had been Tuesday, people emerging after the rain to resume their normal activities. Puddles remained in low spots on the cobblestones, but they were shrinking rapidly in the morning sun. At the storehouse, William spent the morning organizing the space where he would place the fuller's delivery when it arrived. The blue and green and red wools would need proper storage, arranged so he could easily access them for the next market. He shifted some existing stock, creating room on shelves, ensuring everything remained organized and logical. The work was interrupted near midday by a boy who came running from Margaret with a message. Peter, the linen merchant, had arrived and was at their shop. William locked the storehouse immediately and hurried home, not wanting to miss this opportunity. He found Peter in the shop, already spreading samples across Margaret's counter for her inspection. The merchant was perhaps 50 years old, his face weathered from years of travel, his clothing dusty from the road, but his manner cheerful and energetic. He greeted William warmly, an old acquaintance if not quite a friend, their relationship built on years of mutually beneficial transactions. "Master William," Peter said, grasping his hand, "I have excellent goods this trip. The weavers in the northern villages have outdone themselves." William examined the samples Peter displayed, his fingers testing each piece's quality. The linen ranged from coarse, practical weaves to fine, delicate fabrics suitable for the wealthiest households. Peter watched his examination with the patience of a merchant who knew his goods would speak for themselves. "This medium weight," William said, indicating a piece that felt right for his needs. "How much do you have?" 50 Ls total, Peter replied. "Though I expect it will sell quickly, everyone wants this weight for summer garments." They negotiated quantity and price, William's experience telling him when Peter's first offer was fair and when it bore additional discussion. Eventually, they agreed on 30 Ls at a price both found acceptable. Peter would deliver it to William's storehouse later that afternoon, once he had completed his other business in Ashford. William also purchased a small quantity of fine linen, perhaps 10 eels, hoping to attract customers seeking quality goods. And he bought several spools of linen thread, knowing Margaret could sell these in the shop to women doing their own sewing. With business concluded, Peter accepted ale and bread as courtesy required, and they spoke of general matters, roads and weather, other merchants they both knew, the state of trade in various towns. Peter departed eventually to visit other customers, his pack somewhat lighter but his coin pouch considerably heavier. William felt satisfied with his purchases, confident he had bought wisely and at fair prices. Margaret agreed, having observed the negotiations with her own practiced eye. "Good quality throughout," she said, examining one of the thread spools. "These will sell well." The afternoon brought customers to the shop, people who had postponed their errands during Tuesday's rain, now venturing out to complete them. Margaret served them while William returned to the storehouse to prepare for Peter's delivery and the fuller's shipment, both of which would arrive before week's end. At the storehouse, he continued his organizing work, creating systems that would allow him to quickly gather what he needed for Saturday's market. The practical wools went in one section, arranged by color. The linens would occupy another area, sorted by weight and quality. The specialty goods, the crimson wool, the silk ribbons, the fine fabrics, had their own designated space where they received extra protection. Peter's delivery arrived in late afternoon, carried by a boy with a handcart who had been hired for the task. William inspected each piece as it was unloaded, verifying that what he received matched what he had purchased. The linen was exactly as promised, good quality throughout, and he signed Peter's ledger to confirm receipt and payment. He spent the remaining daylight hours properly storing the new linen, wrapping it in protective cloth and placing it on shelves where air could circulate around it. Linen needed to breathe. He had learned years ago, packed too tightly or stored in sealed containers, it could develop mildew or attract insects. Proper storage was as important as proper selection in maintaining quality. By the time William locked the storehouse and walked home, the sun was lowering toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The day's warmth was fading, evening coolness beginning to flow through Ashford streets. William's shadow stretched long before him as he walked, and he felt the pleasant tiredness of a day spent productively. At home, Margaret had already prepared their evening meal, and they sat together at the table as the room grew dim around them. She lit candles against the gathering darkness, and they ate by their gentle light, speaking quietly of the day's events and the preparations still needed before Saturday's market. After supper, William calculated his expenditures for the week, what he had paid the fuller, what he had spent with Peter, comparing these costs against his expected revenues from the coming market. The numbers were satisfactory, showing that his business remained healthy, neither expanding dramatically nor contracting worryingly, but maintaining the steady state that characterized successful long-term trade. Margaret worked on her embroidery while William made his calculations, the scratch of his stylus on a wax tablet a soft counterpoint to the whisper of her needle through fabric. The candles burned steadily, their flames unwavering in the still air. Outside, Ashford settled into night, the sounds of day giving way to evening's quieter rhythms. When William had finished his accounting and Margaret had completed the flower she was stitching, they prepared the house for sleep and climbed to their bedchamber. The day had been full but not exhausting, productive but not stressful, exactly the kind of steady progress that characterized well-managed business. In bed, William lay watching moonlight paint silver patterns on the opposite wall. Tomorrow would bring the fuller's delivery, he thought, and Friday would be spent preparing his market stall. selecting which pieces to display and how to arrange them for maximum effect. Then Saturday would arrive with its bustle and commerce, and the week's cycle would complete itself before beginning again. These rhythms structured his life, giving it shape and meaning. The weekly market, the daily tasks, the seasonal variations in what people bought and when, all of it fit together into a pattern larger than any individual day or transaction. William found comfort in this pattern, in the predictability that allowed him to plan and prepare, to build slowly toward goals rather than lurching from crisis to crisis. His breathing deepened and slowed, his thoughts growing softer and less distinct. Margaret shifted beside him, settling into sleep, and William felt himself drifting toward the same destination. The day's activities faded into memory, tomorrow's concerns had not yet arrived, and in the space between there was only this present moment of rest, this peaceful darkness, this gentle surrender to sleep's patient embrace. The moonlight continued its slow journey across the wall, marking time's passage in silver increments, and William's consciousness gradually released its hold on waking awareness, descending through layers of thought and sensation into the deep quiet where the body restored itself, and the mind found its own mysterious refreshment, preparing for whatever the coming day would bring. Thursday morning announced itself with bird song, a chorus of sparrows and finches greeting the dawn from their perches on Ashford's rooftops and in the gardens tucked behind houses. William woke to this cheerful sound, the room already bright with early sunlight that promised another fair day. He rose feeling refreshed, his body adjusting to the week's rhythm of work and rest. Margaret was at the hearth when he descended, stirring porridge in an iron pot suspended over the flames. The smell was comforting, oats and milk, and a touch of honey, simple food that had sustained working people for generations. They ate together at the table this morning, neither feeling the usual urgency to begin the day's tasks immediately. John the Fuller's boy came by yesterday evening while you were at the storehouse, Margaret said. The cloth will arrive this morning early. William nodded, mentally adjusting his plans. He would need to be at the storehouse when the delivery came, to inspect the goods and ensure everything matched what he had ordered. The Fuller was reliable, but prudent merchants always verified their purchases before accepting them as complete. They finished their meal, and William made his way to the storehouse through streets already active with morning commerce. Bakers were selling fresh loaves. Housewives were drawing water from the town well. Craftsmen were opening their workshops. The day was beginning its steady pulse of human activity, each person moving through their particular role in the vast, interconnected web of community life. At the storehouse, William unlocked his room and prepared to receive the delivery. He spread a clean cloth on his workbench, ready to lay out the fabrics for inspection. He checked that he had adequate shelf space prepared, the areas he had cleared yesterday waiting to receive the new stock. Everything was ready when he heard the sound of a cart approaching and voices calling greetings in the street outside. John the Fuller had come himself rather than sending only his boy, which pleased William. It suggested the Fuller took pride in this delivery and wanted to ensure its proper reception. They exchanged greetings, and John's apprentice began unloading bundles from the cart, carrying them carefully into William's storage room. The blue wool came first, 20 ells as ordered, wrapped in protective linen. William unwrapped it and spread several lengths across his workbench, examining the fabric closely in the morning light. The color was even throughout, a deep, rich blue that would appeal to customers seeking something more distinctive than natural wool tones. The weight was consistent, the weave tight and regular. He nodded his satisfaction. The green wool emerged next, 10 ells of a color that reminded William of forest depths, darker than spring grass but not as black as pine needles. This too passed his inspection, the quality matching what he had seen in John's workshop. The red wool completed the delivery, 5 ells of a rusty burgundy shade that would work well for autumn garments. William examined each piece thoroughly, not rushing, wanting to be certain he understood exactly what he was receiving. John watched with the calm patience of a craftsman who knew his work was sound. When William had finished his inspection and found everything acceptable, he paid the second half of the agreed price, counting out silver coins that John accepted with a nod of thanks. They shared a cup of ale before John departed, standing in the storehouse yard while the apprentice secured the empty cart. They spoke of upcoming markets and mutual customers, the easy conversation of tradesmen who understood each other's work. When John finally climbed onto his cart and guided his horse back toward the road, William returned to his storage room feeling pleased with the transaction. The morning was spent properly storing the new fabrics, wrapping them for protection and placing them on the shelves he had prepared. The blue wool in particular required care. Deep dyes sometimes had a tendency to bleed if exposed to moisture, and William wanted to ensure it remained pristine until sale. He wrapped each piece in linen before shelving it, creating barriers against any dampness that might penetrate the storehouse's thick walls. By midday, the work was complete. William's inventory was now substantially replenished, his shelves well stocked with the variety of goods customers would seek. He felt prepared for Saturday's market, confident he had adequate stock of what people needed and desired. This preparation was part of his craft, anticipating demand, maintaining inventory, ensuring that when customers came seeking cloth, he had appropriate offerings ready. He locked the storehouse and walked home through streets warming in the noon sun. The morning's coolness had burned away, leaving the kind of pleasant warmth that made people slow their movements and seek shade. William found himself walking more leisurely than usual, in no particular hurry, enjoying the simple act of movement through familiar streets. At home, Margaret had the shop closed for the midday hour, a practice she followed during the week when customer traffic was light. She was upstairs preparing their dinner when William arrived, and the smell of cooking filled the rooms. A meat pie she had made that morning, its crust golden and its filling savory with herbs and gravy. They ate together at the table, the pie rich and satisfying, accompanied by ale and fresh bread. Margaret told him about the morning's shop business, 2 customers, both purchasing small amounts for immediate needs. Nothing substantial, but honest sales that added to their week's earnings. William described the fuller's delivery and his satisfaction with the quality received. After dinner, William felt drowsy in the afternoon warmth, the full meal and weeks accumulating labor making his eyelids heavy. He settled into his chair by the window, intending only to rest his eyes for a moment, but sleep claimed him quickly, pulling him down into a deep, dreamless doze. He woke perhaps an hour later to find Margaret working quietly at her embroidery, having let him sleep undisturbed. The afternoon light had shifted, the sun lower in the sky, shadows lengthening across the room. William stretched, working stiffness from his neck and shoulders, feeling somewhat guilty for sleeping during the day but also refreshed by the unexpected rest. "You needed that," Margaret said without looking up from her needlework. "You have been working hard this week." William supposed she was right. The days since the market had been full of activity, inventory and purchases, organizing and storing, the constant mental work of planning and calculating. A brief afternoon sleep was hardly laziness under such circumstances. The remainder of the afternoon passed quietly. Margaret reopened the shop, though few customers came. William worked on his wax tablet, making notes about what he planned to bring to Saturday's market, which pieces he would display most prominently, how he would arrange his stall for best effect. This planning was important. A well-organized stall attracted more customers than a haphazard one, and strategic placement of goods could influence what people purchased. He decided the blue wool should occupy a prominent position, its distinctive color likely to catch eyes and draw people to examine his other offerings. The crimson wool would remain in its position of honor at the center, still waiting for the customer who could appreciate and afford its quality. The practical fabrics would flank the specialty goods, accessible and inviting to those seeking everyday cloth. These decisions made, William set aside his tablet and simply sat, watching the afternoon light fade gradually toward evening. The week was nearly complete now, only Friday remaining before Saturday's market. Friday would be spent in final preparations, loading his cart with the goods he had selected, ensuring his measuring stick and shears were clean and sharp, packing the small items like thread and ribbons that complemented his main stock. Margaret called him down for supper as the sun touched the horizon, and they ate by candlelight as had become their evening custom. The meal was simple, cheese and bread and cold meat left from the midday pie, but it was satisfying, and they lingered at the table after eating, neither quite ready to begin the evening's closing tasks. "Thomas will be home in less than 2 weeks now," Margaret said, her voice soft with anticipation. William felt a warm surge of affection at the thought of seeing their son. Thomas had been gone for nearly 3 months this time, his longest absence since beginning his apprenticeship. William missed the boy's presence, his questions and observations, his growing competence as he learned his trade. "We should plan something special for his visit," William said. "Perhaps invite Edmund and his family for a meal. Thomas always enjoyed Edmund's stories." Margaret smiled, already planning in her mind the meal she would prepare, the preparations she would make to welcome their son home. They spoke of Thomas for a while, remembering small moments from his childhood, marveling at how quickly time had passed and transformed their baby into a young man on the verge of completing his training. Eventually, they prepared the house for night, banking the fire and checking doors, climbing to their bedchamber where the day's warmth still lingered. William removed his clothing and lay down with a sigh, his body grateful for the bed's support. Tomorrow would be busy with final market preparations, and Saturday would bring the week's culmination in commerce and activity. But those concerns could wait. For now, in this peaceful moment between day and sleep, there was only the comfort of bed and home, Margaret's presence beside him, and the quiet satisfaction of another day completed, another small increment of progress in the ongoing work of building and maintaining a life. His eyes closed, his breathing deepened, and Thursday's light and activity faded into Thursday's darkness and rest, the week's rhythm continuing its steady progression towards Saturday's destination, each day a necessary step in the journey, each night a restoration preparing for the next day's labor. The stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient patterns, marking time's passage while Ashford slept, and William's consciousness descended into the deep quiet where dreams waited, insubstantial and strange, the mind's mysterious work of sorting and storing the day's experiences, preparing space for whatever Friday would bring. Friday morning arrived with a quality of anticipation, the sense that the week was gathering itself towards Saturday's purpose. William woke early, his mind already moving through the tasks ahead, the careful preparations that would determine tomorrow's success. He dressed quickly, eager to begin, and found Margaret already at the hearth with porridge ready. They ate standing, as on most weekday mornings, but today their conversation focused entirely on the coming market. Margaret reminded him of things customers had requested during the week: a farmer's wife seeking heavy wool for winter cloaks, a merchant's daughter wanting fine linen for summer shifts. William made mental notes, planning which pieces to bring that might satisfy these expressed needs. "I will help you load the cart this morning," Margaret offered. "You should not carry everything yourself." William accepted gratefully. The cart he used for market transport was stored in a shed behind their house, a sturdy two-wheeled vehicle that could hold several wooden chests plus his stall frame. Loading it properly required thought: heavier items on the bottom, delicate goods on top, everything secured against shifting during transport. After breakfast, they worked together bringing items from the house and storehouse to the cart. William had decided what to bring during yesterday's planning, and now the theory became practical as they carried bundles and chests from storage to cart. The work was physical but not overly demanding, made easier by Margaret's help and by William's years of experience in efficient loading. The practical wools went into the largest chest, folded and layered carefully. William included the brown and gray natural colors that always sold steadily, plus some of the new blue and green from the fuller. The linens filled another chest, the medium weights that were his best sellers, plus some of the fine linen Peter had delivered. A smaller chest held the specialty goods, the crimson wool wrapped in its protective linen, the silk ribbons wound around their wooden dowels, some embroidered trim that Margaret had suggested might interest customers. The stall frame went on the cart's bed, its wooden pieces tied securely so they would not shift during transport. William's tools, measuring stick, shears, scissors, coin pouch, went into a leather satchel that would hang from his belt tomorrow. Everything needed for a day of commerce was assembled and organized, ready for the short journey to Market Square in the morning. By mid-morning, the loading was complete, and the cart stood ready in the shed. William secured it with a length of rope across its contents, ensuring nothing could be disturbed by curious animals or mischievous children. Tomorrow morning, he would harness their horse to the cart and make the brief trip to Market Square well before dawn, giving himself time to set up before customers began arriving. With the major preparation complete, William found himself with unexpected free time in the afternoon. Margaret had reopened the shop, and a few customers trickled through, but business was light. Most people who needed cloth would wait for tomorrow's market, where selection was broader and prices sometimes more negotiable. William climbed to their main room and settled at the table with his wax tablet, reviewing his notes about pricing and inventory one final time. He wanted to be certain in his mind what each piece had cost him, what profit margin he needed, what flexibility he had for negotiation. These numbers were the foundation of successful selling. Knowing them thoroughly allowed him to make quick decisions when customers haggled or requested special arrangements. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, warming the room pleasantly. William worked through his calculations methodically, his stylus scratching figures into the wax, erasing and recalculating when he wanted to verify his thinking. The work was tedious but necessary, the mental preparation as important as the physical loading of his cart. Margaret came upstairs near mid-afternoon, the shop quiet enough that she could leave it briefly unattended. She brought ale and bread, and they shared this simple refreshment while discussing final details. Was there anything William had forgotten? Any last-minute preparations needed? They reviewed the list together, finding nothing overlooked, everything in readiness. "You should rest this afternoon," Margaret said gently. "Tomorrow will be long, and you will need your strength." William recognized the wisdom in her words. Market days demanded sustained physical and mental energy, standing for hours, interacting with dozens of customers, maintaining focus and courtesy from dawn to mid-afternoon. Starting the day already tired was foolish when rest was available now. He set aside his wax tablet and moved to his chair by the window, intending to simply sit quietly for a while. But the warmth and the week's accumulated exertion conspired to make his eyes heavy, and before long he had drifted into a light doze, his body claiming the rest it needed. He woke as the afternoon was fading toward evening, the light through the window golden and slanting. Margaret had returned to the shop, and he could hear her voice below speaking with a customer. William stretched slowly, working out the stiffness that came from sleeping in a chair, feeling somewhat more rested despite the awkward position. He descended to find Margaret completing a sale, a woman purchasing thread and a small length of linen for mending work. The transaction concluded, and the customer departed with thanks. Margaret turned to William with a slight smile. "You snored," she said, not unkindly. "I was resting my eyes," William replied with mock dignity, and they both laughed, the shared moment of humor pleasant after the day's purposeful activity. The evening meal was deliberately light. Margaret had learned over years that William preferred not to eat heavily the night before the market, wanting to wake the next morning without feeling overfull or sluggish. She prepared vegetable pottage and bread, simple food that satisfied without weighing down the stomach. They ate by candlelight as the last of daylight faded from the sky. Beyond their windows, Ashford was settling into Friday evening, families gathering for meals, workshops closing, the week's secular business drawing to a close before Sunday's Sabbath. But for William, the week's true culmination would come tomorrow, when his preparations would transform into commerce and all his careful planning would meet the test of customer interest and response. After supper, they prepared the house for the night earlier than usual. William wanted to sleep well, to wake rested and ready for the long day ahead. In their bedchamber, he lay down feeling the pleasant tiredness that came from a day of productive preparation combined with adequate rest. Everything was ready. He had done all he could to ensure tomorrow's success. Now he needed only to sleep and let his body restore itself. Margaret settled beside him, her presence comforting and familiar. They lay quietly, not speaking, simply sharing the peaceful darkness. Through the window, stars were appearing one by one, emerging from the deepening blue of the evening sky. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A cart rumbled past on the street below, the ordinary sounds of evening in a market town. William's mind drifted across the coming day, imagining the morning's darkness and the walk to Market Square, the familiar process of setting up his stall, the moment when the first customers would approach. He pictured the blue wool catching eyes, the crimson fabric drawing admiration, customers examining his goods with interest and making purchases. These imagined scenes were pleasant and calming, the anticipation of successful trade mixed with the knowledge that he had prepared as thoroughly as possible. His breathing deepened gradually, his thoughts growing softer and less distinct. The week's progression from Sunday's rest through the working days to this Friday evening of preparation felt complete and satisfying, a cycle that would culminate tomorrow before beginning again. There was comfort in this rhythm, in the reliable pattern that structured his life and gave it meaning. Margaret's breathing had already slowed into the steady rhythm of sleep, and William felt himself following the same path, consciousness releasing its grip on waking awareness, descending through layers of thought toward the deep quiet of genuine rest. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it the bustling energy of market day, the interactions with customers, the exchanges of cloth for coins. But for now, in this peaceful Friday darkness, there was only rest and restoration, the body's patient work of preparing itself for the demands ahead, and William surrendered to sleep's embrace with the trust of someone who had completed his preparations and could now simply wait for morning to arrive and transform anticipation into activity, planning into practice, another week's work into another market day's opportunities and rewards. The night deepened around Ashford, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns, and William slept the dreamless sleep of honest tiredness, his mind and body both released into the restorative darkness, gathering strength and clarity for the dawn that would bring Saturday's commerce and the week's fulfillment. Saturday arrived in darkness, William waking before dawn to the profound stillness that marked the hours between night and morning. No birds sang yet, no carts rumbled through streets, no voices called across the silence. He rose carefully, not wanting to disturb Margaret, and dressed by touch in the darkness. his hands finding clothing automatically through long practice. Downstairs, he rekindled the fire, blowing gently on last night's banked embers until flames caught and grew. The light pushed back the darkness gradually, and William ate bread and cheese standing near the hearth, not bothering to sit for this hurried meal. His stomach was tight with the anticipation that always came before the market, not nervousness exactly, but heightened awareness, his body and mind preparing for the demanding day ahead. Margaret appeared as he was finishing, already dressed and ready to help. Together they went to the shed where the loaded cart waited in darkness. Their horse, stabled nearby, nickered softly as William approached with bridle and harness. The animal was accustomed to this routine, standing patiently as William fitted the leather straps and backed the horse into position between the cart's shafts. The horse secured, William checked the cart's contents one final time, his hands running over ropes and bundles, verifying that everything remained properly secured. Satisfied, he took the horse's lead and guided the cart out of the shed into Ashford's dark streets. Margaret walked beside him, carrying the leather satchel with his tools, her presence both practical and comforting. The streets were not quite empty now. Other merchants were beginning their journeys to market, shadows moving through shadows, the quiet sounds of preparation breaking the night's silence. William exchanged soft greetings with Edmund the baker, whose cart was already loaded with the dawn's first loaves. Robert the leather merchant passed going in the same direction, his apprentice helping push his handcart over the cobblestones. The market square appeared ahead, a darker space within darkness, defined by the absence of building walls rather than by any light of its own. William guided his cart to his customary spot near the stone cross at the square's center, the location he had occupied for so many years that it felt almost like ownership despite being public ground. He unhitched the horse and tied it where it could stand comfortably throughout the morning, then turned his attention to unloading. The stall frame came off first, its wooden pieces fitting together with the ease of countless repetitions. William assembled it quickly despite the darkness, his hands knowing every peg and joint, every angle and connection. The frame rose in the dim starlight, solid and familiar, ready to display another market day's goods. Margaret helped him carry the chests from the cart to the stall, and they began the process of arrangement. This was work that required some light, so they moved slowly at first, waiting for dawn's approach to illuminate their efforts. Other merchants worked nearby in similar darkness, everyone engaged in the same patient preparation, transforming the empty square into a temporary city of commerce. The eastern sky began to pale, black softening to deep blue, and shapes emerged from the darkness with increasing clarity. William could see his stall now, see the display bars waiting for fabric, see the counter where he would measure and cut. He and Margaret worked faster as light increased, bringing out the cloth and beginning the careful arrangement. The practical wools went up first, draped over bars in positions William had planned yesterday. The natural colors occupied accessible spots where customers could easily touch and examine them. The blue wool from the fuller went in a more prominent position, its distinctive color already visible in the growing light, ready to catch eyes as William had hoped. The linens came next, arranged by weight and quality, each piece positioned for easy examination. The fine linen Peter had brought occupied a central spot where it would receive attention. The medium weights flanked it, reliable goods that would likely sell steadily throughout the day. Margaret helped him position the specialty items, the crimson wool in its place of honor at the stall's center, the silk ribbons wound attractively on their dowels, the embroidered trim she had suggested displayed where it could be appreciated. Each item received consideration. Each placement served a purpose in the overall design meant to attract, invite, and facilitate purchase. The sky had turned from deep blue to pearl gray, and the first hints of gold touched the eastern horizon. The market square was taking shape around them, other stalls filling with goods, merchants arranging their wares with the same care William brought to his own. The baker's fresh bread sent its irresistible scent across the cobblestones. The egg seller's baskets were filled with pale, smooth ovals. The potter's clay vessels gleamed dully in the increasing light. William stepped back from his stall, his eyes scanning the arrangement critically. Everything was properly positioned, the display balanced and inviting, the goods accessible yet protected. Margaret stood beside him, making her own assessment, and nodded her approval. "It looks well," she said quietly. "You have good stock, well presented." William felt a glow of satisfaction. The preparation was complete. The stage was set. Now he needed only to wait for customers to arrive and hope that his judgment about what to bring and how to display it would prove sound. Margaret departed as the sun finally broke above the roofline, its light flooding the market square with sudden warmth and color. William's fabrics responded to the illumination, each one showing its true character, the blue wool's depth, the crimson fabric's richness, the linen's clean brightness. The transformation was striking, and William allowed himself a moment of pride in what he had created. The first customers were appearing now, early risers who came to market before the crowds, seeking the best selection and the merchant's fresh attention. William straightened his tunic, positioned himself behind his counter, and felt the familiar shift into merchant mode, alert, courteous, ready to serve. An elderly woman approached, her eyes moving across his display with practiced assessment. She paused before the practical wools, her gnarled fingers reaching out to test the fabric's texture. William waited patiently, saying nothing, letting the cloth speak for itself as a merchant should. "This gray," she said finally, "how much per sell?" William named his price, and the day's commerce had begun. The morning unfolded with steady purpose, customers arriving in increasing numbers as the sun climbed higher. William served them with the courtesy and attention he always brought to market day, measuring carefully, cutting cleanly, accepting payment fairly. Between transactions, he adjusted his display, refolding fabrics that had been examined, maintaining the neat appearance that encouraged browsing and purchase. The blue wool attracted attention exactly as he had hoped. Several customers paused to admire it, running their fingers along its surface, holding it up to see how light played across its color. A merchant's wife purchased 4 ells for a special kirtle. A craftsman bought 3 ells, planning a new tunic for feast days. By mid-morning, half the blue wool was sold, and William felt vindicated in his decision to purchase it from the fuller. The crimson wool continued to draw eyes and admiration, but no purchaser yet. William was not concerned. Such specialty goods required patience, and he had plenty of time before needing to reduce the price. The right customer would appear eventually, someone with both the means and the desire to own such distinctive fabric. A young couple stopped at his stall, and William recognized them from the previous week, the pair who had admired the crimson wool but could not afford it. They examined his other offerings today with careful attention and eventually purchased 2 ells of the natural brown wool, practical fabric within their budget. As William measured and cut their purchase, the young woman's gaze drifted once more to the crimson wool, lingering there with obvious longing before she turned away to watch William complete her transaction. The morning sun grew warmer, and the market square filled with the bustle of commerce at its height. Voices called and laughed, children wove between stalls, dogs investigated every corner hopping for dropped food. The mingled sense of bread and animals, humanity and commerce, created the distinctive atmosphere that marked market day. William stood at his stall, part of this larger whole, contributing his particular thread to the vast woven fabric of community life. A farmer approached with specific needs, 8 ells of sturdy wool for work clothing, nothing fancy but well-made and durable. William showed him the appropriate goods, and they negotiated a fair price for the quantity. The transaction was straightforward, both men understanding clearly what was needed and what was fair, and it concluded quickly to mutual satisfaction. Between customers, William allowed himself brief moments of observation, watching the market's ongoing theater unfold around him. Edmund the baker was selling steadily, his supply of bread diminishing visibly. Margaret appeared briefly with ale and a meat pie, sustenance that William consumed gratefully without leaving his post. Robert called a greeting from his nearby stall. The day flowed onward with the steady rhythm of successful commerce. The sun climbed toward its zenith, marking the approach of midday and the market's busiest hours, when the greatest number of people crowded the square and merchants' voices competed for attention. William stood ready, his stall well-stocked and inviting, prepared to serve whoever approached with their needs and their coins, engaged fully in the ancient dance of trade that connected maker to user through the intermediary of merchants like himself, facilitators and curators, judges of quality and arbiters of fair exchange. The midday hours brought the market to its fullest intensity, the square packed with people moving between stalls, examining goods, negotiating prices, completing the week's necessary purchases. William served a steady stream of customers, his hands moving through familiar motions, measuring, cutting, folding, accepting payment, while his voice maintained the patient courtesy that encouraged trust and repeat business. A woman with 3 children in tow stopped at his stall, her attention immediately drawn to the medium-weight linen. The children pulled at her skirts, restless and bored with their mother's shopping, but she ignored their fidgeting with the practiced patience of mothers everywhere. She tested the linen thoroughly, checking its weave and weight, and William could see her mental calculations as she assessed whether the quality justified the expense. "I need 6 ells," she said finally, "for household linens that will see hard use." William measured the 6 ells carefully, his stick moving along the fabric in practiced increments. The linen lay smooth and even across his counter, its quality apparent even to the restless children who had stopped their tugging to watch. He cut cleanly at the marked point and folded the length into a neat bundle that the woman could carry easily. As she counted out her payment, one of the children, a boy perhaps 5 years old, reached toward the silk ribbons with curious fingers. William gently redirected the small hand before it could touch the delicate fabric, and the mother shot him a grateful look while gathering her purchase and herding her children toward the next stall. The sun had reached its highest point, and the heat was becoming notable. William felt sweat dampening his tunic beneath his arms and along his back. Several merchants had rigged cloth awnings over their stalls to provide shade, but William's north-facing position spared him the direct sun, and he judged the discomfort bearable without additional protection. A merchant from a neighboring town approached, someone William recognized from previous markets, though they had never conducted business directly. The man examined William's stock with professional interest, his attention lingering on the crimson wool. He lifted a corner of it, testing its weight and drape, holding it up to see how light passed through the fibers. "Fine work," the merchant said appreciatively. "What do you ask for?" William named his price, the same figure he had held to for weeks now. The merchant's eyebrows rose slightly, not in shock, but in the reflexive response of someone whose trade involved constant price assessment. He examined the crimson wool more closely, clearly weighing whether the quality justified the cost. "It is exceptional fabric," William said quietly. "The madder dye alone represents significant expense, and the wool is finest grade throughout. I have held firm on price because I know its worth." The merchant nodded slowly, still examining the cloth. His fingers moved along its surface, reading the weave's quality, appreciating the dye's evenness. William waited patiently, not pressing, allowing the fabric to make its own argument. "I have a customer in my own town," the merchant said finally. "A wealthy widow who appreciates quality and has means to pay for it. This would suit her purposes well." They negotiated briefly, William offering a small reduction in recognition of the quantity. The merchant wanted the entire remaining piece, perhaps 7 eels. The final price satisfied both parties, representing good profit for William while allowing the other merchant reasonable margin for his own resale. William measured and cut the crimson wool with particular care, feeling both satisfaction at the sale and a slight pang at releasing this beautiful fabric that had occupied his stall's place of honor for so long. The merchant paid in silver, counted carefully into William's palm, and departed with his valuable purchase wrapped securely in protective linen. William felt the pleasant weight of the coins as he added them to his pouch, now substantially heavier than it had been at dawn. The crimson wool's sale represented a significant success, validating his judgment in purchasing such expensive goods and his patience in waiting for the right buyer. With the crimson wool sold, William rearranged his display slightly, moving other specialty items into the now vacant central position. The silk ribbons and fine linen occupied the place of honor, and the overall effect remained balanced and inviting even without the crimson fabric striking presence. The afternoon continued with steady sales, though the intensity had begun to ease somewhat from midday's peak. People who had completed their necessary shopping were departing, heading home to prepare afternoon meals or attend to other tasks. The crowd thinned gradually, and the market's energy shifted from the pressing urgency of mid-morning to a more relaxed pace. A familiar face appeared, Agnes the seamstress, returning as she had promised to see if the blue silk ribbon remained available. William showed her the remaining yardage, and her weathered face brightened with pleasure. She purchased what he had left, 2 yards that would complete her wedding commission with some to spare for trim or decoration. "The young bride will be beautiful," Agnes said as William cut and wrapped her purchase. Blue ribbons woven through white linen, flowers embroidered at the neckline. She will remember her wedding dress all her life. William smiled at the image, pleased to know his silk ribbon would become part of someone's cherished memory. This was trade's deeper satisfaction, not merely exchanging goods for coins, but facilitating the creation of beauty and meaning in people's lives. The church bell rang 2 times past noon, marking the afternoon's progress. Several merchants had begun packing their goods, having sold through their stock or simply deciding to close early. Edmund the baker was long gone, his bread all sold before midday. Margaret the egg seller was wrapping her remaining eggs carefully for transport home. The market was winding toward its conclusion, the week's commerce drawing to its natural close. William continued serving the occasional customer who approached, but he also began the mental process of assessing the day's success. His coin pouch was satisfyingly heavy, substantially heavier than last week. He had sold well across all categories: the practical wools, the linens, the specialty goods. The crimson wool sale alone would have made the day profitable, but the steady accumulation of smaller transactions had built additional success. His stock was notably depleted, which pleased him. Better to sell than to carry goods home unsold. He would need to replenish several items before the next market, particularly the blue wool, which had proven as popular as he had hoped. The medium linens also needed attention, but these were pleasant problems, the kind that indicated healthy demand and successful judgment. A final customer approached as the afternoon grew late, a young man, perhaps 20 years old, who examined William's remaining practical wools with careful attention. He was clearly outfitting himself, probably recently completing an apprenticeship and establishing his own household. William recognized the signs, having been that young man himself years ago, carefully selecting cloth for the new life he was building. The young man purchased 3 ells of natural gray wool, enough for a tunic and perhaps hose. He paid with copper coins carefully counted, each one representing labor and saving, and William accepted them with the same respect he gave silver. The transaction completed, the young man departed with his bundle, and William realized that had been likely his final sale of the day. The sun was descending toward the western roofline now, and the market square had emptied considerably. Perhaps half the merchants remained, and those were beginning to pack in earnest. William decided to follow suit, starting the process of dismantling his display and loading his cart for the return home. He worked methodically, taking down fabrics and folding them carefully before placing them in their transport chests. Each piece received attention, ensuring no damage or soiling had occurred during the day's handling. Most were fine, showing only the minor creases that came from display and examination. One piece of linen had acquired a small smudge along one edge. He made a mental note to clean it before the next market. The stall frame came apart in reverse of its morning assembly, each piece removed and stacked for transport. The whole process took perhaps half an hour, and by the time William had finished loading his cart, the market square was nearly empty. Only a few merchants remained, completing their own packing, and the space that had been so full of life and activity just hours ago now showed signs of returning to emptiness. William hitched his horse to the loaded cart and guided it slowly through the square toward home. The cobblestones showed the day's debris, scattered straw, dropped items, puddles from spilled water. Tomorrow, Sunday, the square would stand empty and quiet, and by Monday the signs of market day would be swept away, leaving only memory until the next Saturday's renewal. At home, Margaret helped him unload the cart, carrying the lighter items while William handled the heavier chests. They worked in the gathering dusk, the day's heat finally beginning to ease, a pleasant coolness flowing through Ashford streets. The work went quickly with 2 pairs of hands, and soon everything was stored properly. Unsold goods returned to the storehouse, the stall framed back in its shed, the cart secured until next week's need. In their main room, as twilight deepened toward night, William emptied his coin pouch onto the table, and he and Margaret counted the day's earnings together. The silver clinked pleasantly as they sorted and stacked it, calculating the total with careful attention. The sum was excellent, better than last week, better than most recent markets. The crimson wool sale had contributed significantly, but the steady accumulation of smaller transactions had built substantial revenue as well. Margaret recorded the amount in her household ledger, while William separated out what would go to purchasing new stock, what would cover household expenses, what would be added to their savings. The division was practiced and automatic, refined over years of managing their business and home together. With the accounting complete, the coins went into their strongbox, and William felt the deep satisfaction that came from a successful market day. His judgment had been sound, his preparation adequate, his service courteous. The week's cycle was complete, and tomorrow he would rest before beginning the whole process again. The inventory and planning, the purchasing and organizing, the preparation leading to another Saturday's commerce. Margaret prepared their evening meal, and they ate by candlelight, too tired for much conversation but content in shared accomplishment. The food tasted especially good after the long day's exertion, and William ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling his body beginning to relax after hours of sustained alertness and activity. After supper, they sat quietly for a short while, neither quite ready for bed despite their tiredness. The candle burned steadily, its flame unwavering in the still air. Outside, Ashford had settled into Saturday evening's quiet, the market's bustle replaced by domestic peace, families gathered in their homes, the week's public business concluded. When they finally climbed to their bedchamber, William felt exhaustion settling into his bones. the good tiredness that came from honest labor successfully completed. He lay down with a sigh of relief, his body grateful for the bed's support after the long day of standing. Margaret settled beside him, and they lay quietly in the darkness, too tired for words but connected by shared experience. Through the window, stars were visible, the same stars that had watched over the morning's pre-dawn preparations, that had witnessed the day's unfolding commerce, that now observed the evening's peaceful conclusion. William's eyes grew heavy, and he felt himself drifting toward sleep, the day's activities fading into memory, consciousness releasing its grip on waking awareness. The market was complete, another week's work fulfilled, another cycle finished and ready to begin again. But those concerns belonged to tomorrow and the days beyond. For now, in this Saturday night's darkness, there was only rest and restoration, the body's patient work of recovery, and William surrendered gratefully to sleep's embrace, descending into the deep quiet where dreams waited, insubstantial and strange, the mind's mysterious journey through the night toward Sunday's dawn and another week's gentle beginning. Sunday morning arrived with the church bell's familiar call, their clear tones floating across Ashford in the dawn's soft light. William woke slowly, his body still heavy with Saturday's exertion, but his mind peaceful, knowing that today required nothing more demanding than worship and rest. He lay quietly for a moment, listening to the bells, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from work completed and reward earned. Margaret stirred beside him, and together they rose to greet the Lord's day, dressing in their better clothing and preparing to join their community in the ancient rhythms of prayer and thanksgiving. The week's commerce was behind them now, the market's bustle replaced by Sabbath stillness, and William felt grateful for both, for the work that gave purpose and provision, and for the rest that restored body and spirit alike. As they walked through Ashford's quiet streets toward the church, the morning sun warm on their shoulders, William thought of the week just past and the one to come, the endless gentle cycle of preparation and fulfillment, labor and rest, commerce and home. Thomas would arrive soon for his visit, bringing his young energy and growing competence. The fuller would have new stock in a fortnight. The linen merchant would return on his monthly rounds. Life would continue its steady progression, measured in market days and seasons, in bolts of cloth sold and silver coins earned, in the small accumulations that built a life of purpose and meaning. The church appeared ahead, its stone tower solid and enduring against the morning sky, and William felt himself settling into the peace that came from knowing his place in the world's vast pattern. Merchant and father, husband and craftsman, a single thread woven into the larger fabric of community that sustained and was sustained by all its members, each contributing their particular gift to the whole. They entered the church's cool dimness, dipped their fingers in holy water, and found their customary places among their neighbors and friends, ready to offer thanks for another week's blessings, and to rest in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new customers, new chances to practice the honest craft that had been his father's before him, and might one day be passed to Thomas or his children after. The endless continuation of work and rest, commerce and worship. The steady rhythm that gave shape and meaning to days that flowed one into another like a gentle stream, carrying him forward through time toward whatever future awaited. content in the present moment, and the simple gifts it offers.